Chapter 254. Possession? When Chen Shi saw what was happening to He Tiangang, he immediately flew into a rage. After letting out an angry grunt, Chen Shi suddenly clasped his hands together in front of his chest. Then he slowly pulled his palms apart. A golden light suddenly appeared between Chen Shi's palms. As he slowly pulled his palms apart, the golden light became brighter and brighter. In the end, it was as if Chen Shi was holding the sun in his hands. The dazzling light that seeped through the gaps between his fingers was so blinding that it was impossible to look at it directly. The golden light in Chen Shi's hands grew even brighter. But in the eyes of the Wulian people. But they didn't see anything. This was because Evil Vanquisher was an attack on the soul. They were not immortal cultivators, so they naturally could not sense the fluctuations in the surrounding spiritual energy. However, although the others could not see it, the azure dragon in front of them clearly knew what was good for it. He Tiangang could be considered to have 8 lifetimes of bad luck. This azure dragon had probably been suppressed for too long, so as soon as it was released, it wanted to find a body to possess. It was not that the azure dragon was not interested in Chen Shi, but the strength that Chen Shi displayed just now was too strong. The azure dragon did not have absolute confidence, so it could only settle for the next best thing. Among everyone present, apart from Chen Shi, He Tiangang's cultivation level was the highest. Naturally, he became the azure dragon's first target for possession. Because the difference in cultivation level between the two was too great, the azure dragon immediately seized control of He Tiangang's body as soon as it entered. After He Tiangang's body was possessed, his eyeballs immediately underwent a huge change. The pair of golden vertical pupils that originally belonged to the azure dragon appeared in He Tiangang's eye sockets, giving off a very strange feeling. Upon closer inspection, this pair of eyes that did not belong to a human seemed to faintly shine with an indescribable cold light. At this moment, Chen Shi suddenly flipped his palm and pushed forward. The white sun flame immediately released a boundless pressure. It was like a spear filled with killing intent, and it instantly blasted towards He Tiangang. Seeing this, He Tiangang's eyes couldn't help but tremble. The vertical pupils in his eye sockets strangely shrank, completely turning into fine lines. But then his pupils suddenly widened, and there were 2 balls of red flames that kept pulsating in them. Then, He Tiangang opened his mouth and let out a roar at Chen Shi that did not sound like a human at all. Roar! Following the roar, the 2 flames suddenly turned into 2 crimson dragons. A mighty fire tornado suddenly gushed out from He Tiangang's eyes, sweeping towards Chen Shi. The golden light and the crimson flame collided violently. In an instant, like a cannonball hitting an armory, a shocking explosion occurred in the hall. The air seemed to be ignited by the raging flames, and the raging flames filled the entire space. However, this was a battle on the level of the spirit, so to outsiders, it was as if nothing had happened. Chen Shi's spirit was damaged, and could not directly use divine telekinesis to fight. But after such a long time of accumulation, his cultivation had mostly recovered, so the power of Evil Vanquisher was naturally far greater than before. However, what Chen Shi did not expect was that his Evil Vanquisher, which he had used all his strength to unleash, was still blocked by the flame spewing out from He Tiangang's eyes. It was obvious how strong the remnant soul of this azure dragon was. Although Wu Lian and the others couldn't see what Chen Shi and He Tiangang were doing, a battle of spirits of this level, just the spiritual storm created by the collision was enough to give them a splitting headache. Naturally, they couldn't pay attention to what was happening around them. Iron Egg Li and Xue Shujian were professional soldiers with strong willpower, but even so, they bitterly held on for about 5 seconds before their eyes rolled back and they completely fainted. If even they were in such a state, there was no need to mention an ordinary person like Professor He, who had no foundation in cultivation. Seeing their companions collapse one after another, the remaining neutralizing grandmasters gritted their teeth and held on for about 10 seconds before collapsing to the ground one after another. Only 2 people remained standing in the hall. In contrast to Chen Shi's calm and collected appearance, He Tiangang's condition was clearly much worse. Not only was his face pale, but his forehead was also covered in sweat. His tired appearance made him look like an athlete who had just finished a round of a marathon. After all, the azure dragon had just successfully taken over this body, This level of exhaustion was naturally a bit too much for it to bear. So when it saw Chun-Shi acting as if nothing had happened, the Azure Dragon's heart immediately trembled. It couldn't help but use He Tiangong's body to speak. "You are very strong. I have no grudge with you, let me leave. I will remember your kindness." His accent was very strange. He sounded like a foreigner. It was just a short sentence, but it took a lot of effort to speak. Obviously, the Azure Dragon hadn't gotten used to this body yet and couldn't control it skillfully. Hearing this, Chun-Shi looked at him deeply, then replied with a serious face, "I can let you go, but the premise is, you have to leave his body." No. Hearing that Chun-Shi wanted it to leave He Tiangong's body, the Azure Dragon immediately replied, "Without a body, I can't leave here." "Okay, then there's nothing to talk about." Chun-Shi shrugged indifferently, then said with a regretful expression, "I brought him here. You took over his body right in front of me, and now you want to leave safely like nothing happened? Let me tell you, there's no such thing as a cheap deal in this world." After hearing Chun-Shi's words, He Tiangong's expression immediately became uncertain, as if he was thinking. But Chun-Shi didn't intend to give him too much time to think. Although He Tiangong's body was occupied by the Azure Dragon, his consciousness obviously couldn't be swallowed by the Azure Dragon so quickly. So as long as the Azure Dragon's remnant soul was driven out of He Tiangong's body, then He Tiangang could still be saved. If time dragged on, and the Azure Dragon completely merged with this body, even a golden immortal couldn't do anything. Seeing that the Azure Dragon still didn't answer, Chun-Shi decisively spread out his hands, and two dazzling lights lit up in his palms again. Since Evil Punisher couldn't destroy it, then he could try another move. Anyway, he had plenty of tricks up his sleeves. Seeing that Chun-Shi seemed to want to fight again, the Azure Dragon immediately cowered, so it quickly said, "Wait, I have an idea." Hearing this, Chun-Shi immediately retracted his hands and asked, "What idea?" "You help me. Open the channel. After the channel is open, I'll come out from his body. Then you cover me and leave." "Okay." Chun-Shi pondered for a moment, so he readily agreed to the Azure Dragon's request. There was no exit in this hall, and the four walls were incomparably hard. Presumably, only the Azure Dragon knew how to get out. Since that was the case, there was no harm in cooperating. He helped the Azure Dragon escape, and the Azure Dragon left He Tiangong's body. Chapter 255. The man and the dragon quickly reached a consensus. After that, Chun-Shi learned the way to leave the hall from He Tiangang. The hall was like a sealed jar, and the only way out was above the dome. In the center of the dome, where the light beam came from, there was a crystal-like thing. As long as Chun-Shi flew up and took the crystal, they could leave this place. It sounded very simple, so Chun-Shi flew directly to the dome according to what the Azure Dragon said, and found a crystal in the center of the dome. It was a hexagonal rhombus-shaped crystal, and its size was about the same as the crystal trophy used in award ceremonies. Chun-Shi tried to dig at the crystal with his hand, but to his surprise, the crystal was easily removed. The moment Chun-Shi removed the crystal, it was as if there was a huge earthquake outside, causing the entire hall to shake violently. Chun-Shi looked down and found that several cracks suddenly appeared on the walls around the hall. It was not right to call them cracks, because these cracks were very neat, as if they could have been separated. Under Chun-Shi's slightly surprised gaze, the hall bloomed like a lotus in summer. The ground turned into a lotus pod. The walls turned into petals, and bloomed in front of Chun-Shi. The arc-shaped walls fell out one by one at a very fast speed, but they did not make any sound when they fell. The wind and snow that filled the sky suddenly came. Chun-Shi looked up and found that he was now in an observatory, and the spirit fog that covered the sky and the moon had disappeared. Everything happened very quickly. The moment the cracks appeared on the walls of the hall, He Tiangang suddenly showed a look of ecstasy. Almost without any hesitation, just as the wall cracked to reveal a gap big enough for an adult to leave, the Azure Dragon controlled He Tiangong's body and jumped out of the hall. Run. As for the agreement between it and Chun-Shi, it was originally the Azure Dragon's stalling tactic. In fact, the Azure Dragon had never thought of leaving He Tiangong's body. After all, the heaven-defying act of seizing another's body was not without restrictions. This time, in order to seize He Tiangong's body, the Azure Dragon had already paid a great price. Therefore, Chen Shi wanted it to obediently leave He Tiangong's body and look for a new body to seize. In the Azure Dragon's eyes, this was simply wishful thinking. With only a strand of remnant soul left, it could be said to be a rootless duckweed. Now that it had finally found a place to stay, the Azure Dragon naturally would not give up so easily. Although this body was still too weak at the moment, as long as it was given enough time, the Azure Dragon was confident that it could transform it into its original body. The little abacus in Azure Dragon's heart rang loudly, but it missed the most important point. That was, it did not have a correct understanding of Chen Shi's cultivation. Therefore, as soon as He Tiangang moved, Chen Shi, who was flying in the air, lowered his head and looked at He Tiangang's fleeing figure. There's a path to heaven, but you don't want to take it. There's no door to hell, but you insist on barging in. Since you're going back on your word, don't blame me for being merciless. Chen Shi spread out his hands, and the vital essence in his body surged. Immediately, 2 balls of light appeared in his palms. Then, Chen Shi held the 2 balls of light and quickly gestured in front of his chest. Suddenly, he slammed his palms toward He Tiangang's back. 49 Forms of Heavenly Divination, Soul Dao Chapter. Tai Suppression 3 Cheese as 1, Soul Catcher. Soul Catcher was slightly different from Evil Vanquisher, because Soul Catcher was a pure spiritual attack. Chen Shi's spiritual injury was very serious, so the moment he forcefully used Soul Catcher, his face flushed red. This move could be said to hurt the enemy 1,000 times, but hurt himself 800 times. However, the Azure Dragon had gone back on its word first, so today, Chen Shi was determined to destroy its soul. No matter what kind of position it had in Chinese culture, in short, today, the proud dragon has no regrets. Perhaps sensing the pressure coming from behind, He Tiangang stepped on the snow and quickly leaped out. At the same time, he did not forget to look back. When he saw the golden light in Chen Shi's hands, He Tiangang suddenly stopped. Then he turned toward Chen Shi and let out a resounding dragon roar. Roar! The roar of a tiger and the roar of a dragon was mighty and continuous. The Azure Dragon probably knew that today's matter could not be settled peacefully. Therefore, after this deep roar sounded from afar, the shadow of an Azure Dragon suddenly appeared behind He Tiangang. The hidden dragon sleeps, and its roar shakes thousands of mountains. The shadow of the Azure Dragon coiled in the air. At the same time that Chen Shi slammed his palms, the shadow of the Azure Dragon soared into the air with a monstrous force. Like a giant python pouncing on its prey, it opened its bloody mouth and rushed toward Chen Shi. At this moment, Chen Shi seemed to see the shadow of great-granduncle in it. It was a very familiar scene, but Chen Shi did not have time to think about it, because the Soul Catcher had been released. Like a descendant shooting down the sun, 2 light arrows shot out from Chen Shi's hands, directly toward the shadow of the Azure Dragon that was pouncing toward him. And at the moment when the light arrows and the shadow of the Azure Dragon collided in the air, the whole scene between heaven and earth seemed to be frozen. Snow fluttered in the snowy mountains. Under the sparse moonlight, the wind and snow filled the sky. The light arrows shot in from the dragon's head. After a flash, they pierced through the entire shadow of the Azure Dragon, and directly entered He Tiangang's body. The resounding dragon roar sounded again, but this time it did not come from He Tiangang's mouth. Instead, it came from the shadow of the Azure Dragon. As if it had suffered a huge injury, the shadow of the Azure Dragon trembled violently. Then it curled up into a circle in the air, raised its head and roared angrily toward the sky. Formless sound waves continuously sounded from the mouth of the Azure Dragon. Circle after circle, they spread in all directions. At the same time, He Tiangang, who was on the ground, stared with his slightly ferocious golden vertical pupils. There was a trace of disbelief on his face. However, the surprise on his face did not last long. After a few breaths of time, He Tiangang suddenly closed his eyes under the expressionless gaze of Chen Shi, and then fell into the thick snow. At this time, the shadow of the Azure Dragon in the air, like a group of disturbed fireflies, suddenly turned into specks of starlight and disappeared in the wind and snow. The soul was destroyed. This azure dragon that only existed in myths and legends was mercilessly obliterated by Chen Shi. Everything returned to silence. Only the sound of the wind was left between heaven and earth. After looking at the diamond-shaped crystal in his hand thoughtfully, Chen Shi looked down at the hall below. Chapter 256. Chen Shi flew in the air and looked down at the scenery below. The thick spirit fog had dissipated, so his field of vision was wide open. After carefully observing his surroundings, Chen Shi found that he was now on a snowy mountain not far from the Siala mountain pass. In other words, although the formation entrance was in the oasis, the formation core was the unknown snowy mountain next to it. The walls around the hall were not closed, like an open-air camp. The dark ground was in stark contrast to the surrounding white snow. The wind and snow were too strong, and the temperature was at least -60 degrees Celsius. Therefore, in just a few minutes, Wu Lian and the others lying on the ground were covered with a thin layer of snow. Chen Shi estimated that they would not wake up for a while, so he moved the survivors to the temporary laboratory in the oasis. After settling the group of people, Chen Shi flew back to the spacious hall and began to carefully study the rhombus-shaped crystal in his hand. This rhombus-shaped crystal was transparent, and a faint purple mist constantly rose in the middle. Chen Shi held his breath and silently felt the cold feeling coming from the crystal. But after studying it for a while, he still could not detect any signs of energy fluctuations from it. It was as if it was just an ordinary piece of natural crystal. But that was obviously impossible. If the hall was the cage that imprisoned the azure dragon, then this crystal was obviously the key. It was just that Chen Shi did not know how to use this key. The flow of time in the hall was different from the outside world, so this kind of cultivation place was undoubtedly very attractive to the current Chen Shi. If he had the key to the hall, then he could come here to cultivate when he had nothing to do. A cultivation place comparable to Tianxian. How could Chen Shi not be tempted? Thinking of this, Chen Shi could not help but show a trace of annoyance on his face. If he had known, he would not have hit so hard. The azure dragon didn't keep its word. Chen Shi was worried that He Tiangong's soul would be devoured by the azure dragon if it dragged on, so he decisively killed him. Now that he thought about it, it was quite a pity. The main hall was obviously a cage used to suppress the azure dragon. Although they did not know how long it had been imprisoned here, judging from the azure dragon's behavior just now, it clearly had a certain degree of understanding of this main hall. However, it was too late to say anything now. He had already killed the azure dragon, so Chen Shi could only slowly explore the secrets of the hall. After pondering for a while, Chen Shi began pouring his true essence into the crystal. When the true essence flowed into the crystal, the dense purple qi in the crystal began to surge. There's hope. Seeing this, Chen Shi couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. He began to madly pour his qi into the crystal. The surging true essence continued to flow into the crystal, and the dense purple qi inside immediately began to revolve. As the dense purple gas spun faster and faster, a faint purple vortex gradually formed in the crystal like a glass of water being shaken. After that, Chen Shi held the crystal and looked at the main hall expectantly. However, he waited for a while, but there was no movement in the main hall. Is it scrapped? Chen Shi frowned and muttered to himself. Only then did he fly into the main hall and look at the surroundings with some regret. Before the main hall was unsealed, it was like a flower bud that had not bloomed. After Chen Shi plucked the crystal, the lotus began to bloom. With the base of the main hall as the center, the walls fell back one by one and split into 16 petals. The shape of each side was quite similar to the petals of the lotus. This shape, it did not look like the 9 lotus seats under the gods. Chen Shi came to one of the walls and began to touch and knock on it, trying to find some useful clues. However, after studying for a while, he did not find anything strange, so he had to give up helplessly. This main hall was probably the same as the formation, which was a one-time use, so there was no way to restore it after it was activated. What a pity! Chen Shi flew to the top of the main hall against the wind and snow. After reluctantly looking back at the black lotus blooming on the top of the snow mountain, he was about to leave with some regret. However, at the moment he turned around, Chen Shi suddenly remembered a sentence that the azure dragon once said. Without a body, I can't leave here. Without a body, there was no way to leave here. Once this place was opened, the wind would blow on all sides. How could he not get out? Thinking of this, Chunshi could not help but raise his eyebrows. He immediately turned around and flew into the main hall. Then he sat cross-legged on the obsidian floor. After setting up a defensive formation, he began to try to let his soul out of his body. Soul out of the body. For Chunshi, whose soul had been damaged, this was actually a very dangerous thing to do. If he was not careful, his soul might be destroyed, leaving only an empty shell without a soul. It was difficult for Chunshi to even use his divine sense, let alone his soul out of his body. Therefore, just as he was about to leave his body, he immediately suffered a backlash. His face could not help but turn pale. Chunshi had no choice but to temporarily stop this dangerous behavior, and then silently adjust his breathing. Danger always accompanied opportunity. This cultivation place was extremely tempting to Chunshi, so he did not want to give it up. Therefore, after a simple adjustment, Chunshi began to try again. Bit by bit, he let his soul out of his body. The shape of the soul was not fixed. Although the Azure Dragon had been imprisoned for a long time, its soul had always maintained the appearance of its original body. From this, one could see the strength of the Azure Dragon's soul. Because Chunshi's soul was damaged, his soul looked like a weak flame. It was so weak that it could be extinguished by the wind at any time. When the flame flew out from between Chunshi's eyebrows, Chunshi entered a mysterious state. He didn't need eyes or ears, but he could clearly see everything around him. Even how a snowflake fell from the sky and how many times it spun in the air, Chunshi was very clear. This was the so-called divine sense. It was a type of perception that transcended the five senses. It was like a radar, and even the rustling of grass in the wind could not escape his divine sense. After his soul left his body, Chunshi, who had turned into a flame, carefully approached the edge of the hall. And just as Chunshi's soul was about to float out of the hall, a bright light suddenly appeared in front of him. Sure enough, although the hall was still in the shape of a lotus platform, when Chunshi's soul approached the edge of the lotus platform, circles of strange light patterns immediately appeared around him. Looking carefully, the light patterns were exactly the same as the patterns carved on the dome. Looking at the ground, the protruding lines on the obsidian floor were also strangely glowing at this moment. In an instant, the sky and the ground were full of light patterns. Like two large nets, Chunshi was firmly trapped in the center of the hall. Inescapable net. Chapter 257. Looking at the strange light patterns that covered the sky in front of him, Chunshi was not surprised but happy. Through the perception of his divine sense, he had already keenly noticed that the diamond-shaped crystal in his hand had a new change. The dense purple gas in the middle of the crystal was originally in the shape of a whirlpool, but when Chunshi's divine sense floated to the edge of the hall, the whirlpool immediately turned into the shape of a lotus, and the shape looked somewhat similar to the current appearance of the hall. Seeing this, Chunshi immediately returned his divine sense to his body, ending this dangerous action. After his divine sense returned to his body, Chunshi was still sitting cross-legged on the ground. After silently adjusting for a while, he finally opened his eyes. Forcing his divine sense to leave his body was still too much for the current Chunshi. Therefore, after just a few minutes, his face became very pale, and he looked like a patient who had just recovered from a serious illness. However, although his face was ugly, Chunshi could not help but smile. Because he discovered a secret, and that was, this seemingly ordinary crystal was actually the legendary soul crystal. The so-called soul crystal was actually a strange crystal that could host the divine sense. This kind of crystal was also very rare in the Tianyuan world. The soul crystal was very precious. On one hand, it was extremely rare, and on the other hand, it was a necessary material to refine divine sense attack-type magic treasures. In addition to being able to refine magic treasures, the soul crystal, as a kind of spiritual treasure, had the effect of warming and nourishing the divine sense. With the environment on Earth, it was obviously impossible to breed a magical medicine that could heal divine sense injuries. Therefore, this soul crystal was definitely a life-saving straw for Chunshi, whose divine sense was injured. No wonder this hall could imprison the Azure Dragon's divine sense. It was obviously because of this soul crystal. Thinking of this, Chun-Shi had a rough understanding of the mechanism of the hall's operation. Using the soul crystal as the eye of the formation to imprison the azure dragon, who was only left with his divine sense. And the reason why he Tiangang and the others had not triggered any mechanism after being trapped for more than a month was, they were not immortal cultivators, so they did not have enough pure true essence to trigger the mechanism. Therefore, this array formation and the main hall were obviously set up by immortal cultivators. Moreover, this unknown immortal cultivator was at least at the insightful emptiness realm. Otherwise, it would be impossible for him to set up such a grand formation that involved the true meaning of the word void. With the soul crystal as the core of the formation, if not for his appearance and triggering the mechanism in the hall, the azure dragon who had lost his physical body would never have been able to escape the seal. There are also immortal cultivators on Earth. Thinking of this, Chun-Shi suddenly frowned. It was said that the proud dragon had no regrets, but now he was a little regretful. He should have left Azure Dragon alive to interrogate him. But what was done, and there was no point in regretting it now. Therefore, Chun-Shi could only put this question aside for the time being. Then he closed his eyes and concentrated, trying to let his spirit enter the soul crystal. The soul fire once again flew out from between Chun-Shi's eyebrows, and then directly flew into the diamond-shaped crystal in his hand. After Chun-Shi's spirit flew into the soul crystal, a feeling as warm as the sun in March immediately enveloped his spirit. It was a very wonderful experience, and it made Chun-Shi feel very comfortable. His injured spirit could only sense things within a radius of 10 meters, but after his spirit entered the soul crystal, the range of Chun-Shi's divine sense suddenly expanded and covered the entire mountain in an instant. In an instant, with the crystal as the center, Chun-Shi could sense every movement in the wind and grass. This feeling, he had not experienced it for a long time. Nourishing the spirit was an additional effect of the soul crystal. Naturally, it would not be as fast as the magic medicine, and it would take a long time. Therefore, at this time, Chun-Shi could not help but think of the main hall. As soon as he thought of this, a series of rumbling sounds suddenly came from the hall. Following that, the 16 walls began to slowly rise up and gradually close together. The main hall changed back to its original appearance. The soul crystal, which was the core of the array, could still control the main hall. Seeing this, Chun-Shi could not help but feel happy. He immediately counted silently in his heart. He wanted to calculate the difference between the flow of time in the main hall and the outside world. Chun-Shi enjoyed the nourishment of the soul crystal as he counted seriously. When he counted to 10,000, Chun-Shi thought of something again. The main hall was suddenly like a remote-controlled toy, and it slowly bloomed with a rumbling sound. Each number was exactly 1 second. In other words, he stayed in the main hall for about 166 minutes. Before the main hall was fully opened, Chun-Shi excitedly flew out of the main hall and rushed directly in the direction of the temporary laboratory. When he brought everyone back to the laboratory, it was about 1:30 in the morning. He counted 10,000 seconds in the main hall. 166 minutes, which was 7 hours. According to the flow of time that he Tiangang said, if the main hall did not lose its effect, then only about 2 minutes had passed in the outside world. The more Chun-Shi thought about it, the more excited he became. He quickly rushed back to the oasis from the top of the mountain. There was a quartz clock in the temporary laboratory. The answer he wanted was there. The wind and snow were still in the sky. Thick dark clouds blocked the moonlight, so the surroundings were pitch black. After nervously opening the storm door of the laboratory, Chun-Shi saw He Tiangang and the others, who were still unconscious. In the dim laboratory, only one energy-saving lamp was still on. Next to the energy-saving lamp was the quartz clock that Professor He had brought. Chun-Shi walked to the table and looked down at the time on the table. He was stunned. The time on the quartz clock indicated that it was 1:55 in the morning. When he left, the time should be around 1:34 in the morning. Putting aside some errors, it should be around 20 minutes. However, he stayed in the main hall for a full 10,000 seconds. In other words, the ratio of the flow of time between the main hall and the outside world should be about 8 times. It was not as exaggerated as 1:100. However, even if it was only 8 times the time difference, it was more than enough for Qin Shi. One day in the outside world was 8 days in the main hall. What kind of concept was that? Qin Shi thought about it for a while. However, he vaguely felt that something was wrong. According to what He Tiangang said, they had been trapped in the hall for more than a month. Why was it that the time difference between the hall and the outside world was only 8 times that of the outside world? A month in the main hall should be at least 4 days in the outside world. Qin Shi thought about it for a long time, but could not figure it out. In the end, he could only put this question to the back of his mind. He planned to confirm it after He Tiangang woke up. In short, it did not matter if it was 8 times or 100 times. This time, he had really found a treasure. After confirming the use of the main hall and the soul crystal, Qin Shi immediately set up a restriction in the temporary laboratory. As soon as someone woke up, he would know immediately. After that, Qin Shi plunged into the main hall and began to use the soul crystal to heal the injuries to his soul. Because his soul was out of his body, he could not cultivate. Therefore, in his boredom, he could not help but let his imagination run wild. Starting tomorrow, after Nian fell asleep, he could secretly bring Ying here. Then they could cultivate together as husband and wife and... Chapter 258. Morning, 6:27 a.m. When Qin Shi sensed that someone had woken up in the laboratory through the restriction, he stopped cultivating for the night. Although only 4 hours had passed in the outside world, he had stayed in the hall for a full day and a half. Time and space were concepts that were both independent and interconnected. This was not the heavenly jade realm, but Earth. Other people only had 24 hours a day on Earth, and Qin Shi was also on Earth. However, he could extend his day to nearly 200 hours through the hall. What did 200 hours mean? It was enough to turn a newbie who didn't even know how to loot a bag into a sly old fox who lay in the bushes and waited patiently for a delivery. This kind of miraculous effect that could be called a miracle naturally moved Qin Shi, who had never been moved by external things. As for why the flow of time in the hall was different from the outside world, this question was too profound and was completely beyond the level of a soul formation cultivator. Therefore, Qin Shi was at a loss at this moment. He couldn't figure it out. Although the hall was very mysterious, Qin Shi vaguely felt a sense of anticipation in his heart. Perhaps this hall, which involved the true meaning of time, was not only an excellent place for cultivation, but also a necessary step for him to take another step above the soul formation stage. The hall was too important for Qin Shi. Therefore, when he left, Qin Shi set up an illusion formation around the hall and hid the hall openly. From now on, this would be his secret base. For this, Qin Shi had even made up a very believable story. If Wu Lian started an investigation, he would just have to say that it was all an illusion. The reason why He Tiangang and the others were trapped in the hall for more than a month was because they were under an illusion, and mistakenly thought that they had been trapped in the hall for more than a month. In reality, they had only slept for one night, and had a very, very long dream. Since the hall and the formation were both dreams, then the Azure Dragon was also a product of the dream, from the beginning to the end. Qin Shi only did one thing, and that was to wake them up from their dreams. As for why everyone had the same dream, it was because the illusion was affecting everyone. In addition, the reason why the team had lost members was because the illusion had misled these weak-willed members. It was like sleepwalking, causing them to leave the camp in an unconscious state, and then completely disappear in the vast snowy mountains. This trip probably bodes ill rather than well. In short, being able to survive was all due to luck. Everything that everyone experienced was just a dream and illusion. It was a perfect explanation. At the same time, it was Qin Shi's white lie. After all, what was the point of Wu Lian sending so many people if even he couldn't figure it out? I'll fool him first, and he'll slowly investigate in the future. By the time Qin Shi returned to the laboratory, only the 2 neutralizing grandmasters were awake. When He Tiangang and the professors woke up, it was already 10 o'clock in the morning. Because he had almost been possessed by the Azure Dragon, He Tiangong's mental state was very bad after waking up. When Qin Shi saw this, he told him to rest well. Although Qin Shi's cultivation was very high, he wasn't an official member of the Wu Lian. Therefore, He Tiangang was actually the person in charge of this mission. After that, Chunxi explained the lie he had made up in detail in front of everyone. When everyone finished listening to his explanation, they all had extremely shocked expressions on their faces. Such a realistic experience was actually just a dream? Although everyone felt that this matter was too strange, there was still time to prove it. Therefore, after digesting it, they could only reluctantly believe Chunxi's words. This so-called dreamland was indeed a little too ridiculous for them. In fact, if they thought about it carefully, they could find many loopholes in Chunxi's words. For example, how could they explain the smell of dirt on their bodies after not bathing for more than a month? Also, how could they explain the consumption of food over the past month? There were too many suspicious points. No one was an idiot. However, Chunxi's words were reasonable, and there was also time to prove it. Therefore, no matter how doubtful everyone was, they had to convince themselves to believe Chunxi's words in the end. After all, they couldn't think of a better explanation. The team had inexplicably lost members. This was a serious matter. Therefore, even though He Tiangang still didn't understand the situation, he still honestly recorded everything in the mission log. Just like what Chunxi said, it was already good enough that they survived. As for what exactly happened last night, this was obviously not a question he should be thinking about now, because he was also a smart person. The snow had been blowing heavily all night. Now it was finally sunny. He Tiangang had already seen the strangeness of the oasis. Therefore, the first thing he did after the weather cleared was to move the temporary laboratory to the edge of the oasis. It was about 200 meters away from the oasis on a glacier plain. At this moment, he would rather be in an environment of -50 degrees Celsius in the cold wind than easily get close to the oasis. As long as the professors finished collecting the data, He Tiangang could take everyone on a trip and leave. However, this process would take about 10 hours. Because of this, He Tiangang's heart was almost in his throat. He could only keep praying in his heart that nothing would go wrong. Unlike He Tiangang, who was on tenterhooks, Chunxi was very calm. After patrolling the area with everyone, Chunxi stuffed a stone into He Tiangang's hand. The spirit fog dissipated, and the mysterious 5 elements formation also disappeared. Although the hall didn't disappear, the soul crystal, which was the core of the formation, was in his hands. The danger was gone. So Chunxi was thinking, was it time for him to get off work and go home? It was almost noon. If Nian didn't see him when she woke up, would she cry to Ying? When he thought of the little girl's clingy look, Chunxi suddenly became eager to go home. He couldn't wait to fly back to the little girl's side. After last night's experience, when He Tiangang saw Chunxi handing over another stone, he didn't even wait for Chunxi to speak. He Tiangang rushed to take the stone and smiled. I understand. Mr. Chun, go do your work. I'll throw the stone if there's anything. Hearing this, Chunxi suddenly smiled. Saving his life was worth it. This He Tiangang was interesting. After talking with He Tiangang, Chunxi left the Saikin Glacier. When he returned to Chengdu, it was already 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Chunxi hid his body and landed in a secluded alley behind Wuhou Shrine Street. He had just walked out of the alley and looked up to see that the entrance of Aunt Zhang's neighborhood was crowded with people. A police car was parked by the side of the road. Many people surrounded the security booth and discussed. Looking at the situation, it seemed that something big had happened in the neighborhood. Although they were separated by a street, Chunxi's ears were very sharp. Therefore, when he walked to the neighborhood, a conversation among the onlookers instantly made Chunxi frown. I heard that a child was kidnapped. What a big child. 4 or 5 years old. Is it a boy or a girl? Little girl. She looks so obedient. Oh, why don't those bastards get their retribution? Xiao Qiu is so wicked. He's probably been hit by a car and died on the road. Attention Lamakes 666. Chapter 259. There was a child abducted in the community? A 4 or 5-year-old child, a little girl. When Chunxi heard this conversation, he couldn't help but frown deeply. Although he also knew that it was impossible for Nian to be abducted, as a father, Chunxi still subconsciously thought of Nian. So his heart was more or less a little nervous. There weren't many things in this world that could make him nervous. Nianyan's safety was obviously the first priority. But Nianyan couldn't have been abducted. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. Even if the earth exploded, it was impossible. This was because he put a lot of enchantment magic weapons on Nianyan. Once the enchantment was triggered, even if Chunxi was far away on the moon, he would immediately know. Moreover, with Qin Ruoying and Aunt Zhang's meticulousness, it was obviously impossible for them to let Nianyan run around alone. So they basically eliminated the possibility of Nianyan getting lost. However, even if he knew that this was impossible, Chunxi was still a little worried, so he subconsciously quickened his pace. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived at the gate of the community. Auntie Zhang's neighborhood was an old-fashioned neighborhood that didn't even have elevators. Naturally, there wouldn't be any grand decorations at the entrance of such a neighborhood. Even the railings for parking fees were only built after cars became popular. There were many people gathered at the gate of the community. Most of them were uncles and aunties above the age of 40. The family who lost the child lived in the building next to Aunt Zhang's. The child's parents had to work, so it was usually the grandparents who took care of the child. Now that the child was lost, the old couple could only sit on the ground and cry helplessly. The old couple was so sad that they couldn't speak, but the onlookers were talking one after another, giving the police who came to check the situation a headache. After all, losing a child attracted more attention than jumping off a building. There were only 3 surveillance cameras in the community, and one of them was at the gate. However, the resolution of these cameras wasn't high, and they were in black and white, so the images looked very blurry. After the police checked the surveillance footage based on the time when the child went missing, it took them a lot of effort to find the footage of the child leaving the neighborhood. The child ran out on her own, but she was following behind a woman riding an electric scooter. It seemed that she was willing. Human traffickers generally liked to abduct children under the age of 5, because the children's minds were not fully developed yet. Naturally, they would not be vigilant and would be pleased with toys or candy. Speaking of human traffickers, it was actually an occupation, with a long history. In ancient times, there was a saying that there were 3 religions and 9 classes. Human traffickers were one of the 9 classes. In ancient times, they were called demons of time. They did immoral things like abducting people. However, compared to modern times, human traffickers in ancient times were still too naive. After abducting women and children, they would only sell them for money. If the abducted women and children were lucky, they might even be sold to a rich family and live a better life than before. Now, in addition to human trafficking, human traffickers have also found a new way to sell organs. Abduct the child first, sell the organs, and then sell the child for money. If the child couldn't be sold, then break the child's arms and legs and let the child beg. If begging didn't work, then let them steal. What if they couldn't even steal? That was very simple. Throw them into the AIDS ward. If they tested positive for AIDS, they would be assigned to the AIDS team. In the future, they would be responsible for collecting debts. If there was a debt collector who didn't pay up, then they would think of ways to infect the debt collector. In short, they made the best use of everything, and their methods were beyond the imagination of ordinary people. It could be said that, utterly devoid of conscience, to the human traffickers, children were just valuable goods in their eyes. The big goods were boys, and the small goods were girls. Of course, there were only a few such large-scale human traffickers. Ordinary small fish and shrimps would not be so cruel. Nowadays, parents were aware of this, so they would teach their children not to talk to strangers from a young age. Under such circumstances, this woman was able to get the child to leave with her willingly. She was obviously a repeat offender. If she was caught, she would definitely be shot to death. It was just after the new year, and the human traffickers were already at work. Parents with children at home naturally felt afraid. Since one went missing, there was a possibility that a second one would go missing. Therefore, a few onlooking parents immediately used this opportunity to educate their children. Suddenly, the children were so scared that they started to cry. Outside the community was an old street, and there were no cameras. Therefore, the police had to carefully look through the entry and exit records for the entire day. After a long search, they finally found the woman's face. However, This woman had a certain level of anti-detection awareness. She was wearing an ordinary down jacket with a hood, and she even wore a hat. Therefore, the woman's face could not be seen clearly on the surveillance screen. Seeing this, the two police officers suddenly looked at each other helplessly. Well, this was probably another unsolved case. It wasn't that they didn't work hard, but they really couldn't do anything. As parents, they didn't look after their children and let their children be abducted by human traffickers. Even if they called the police in time, in this vast sea of people, where could the police find them? They could only walk through the streets and ask door to door. They would be thankful if they could get a little bit of useful information. After all, the human traffickers were not stupid. The kind of idiot who suddenly wanted to commit a crime because of a lack of money was always in the minority. The habitual criminals would definitely plan a retreat in advance. It was indeed difficult to catch. Chun-Shi walked around the crowd into the community. From afar, he saw Aunt Zhang's family and Qin Ruoying, who was holding the little boy. The little boy was lying on Qin Ruoying's body, his two hands tightly wrapped around her neck. His little face was full of nervousness and timidity. Aunt Zhang probably took the opportunity to educate him. Chun-Shi squeezed into the crowd and walked in their direction. The little boy stood high and could see far, so before he could get close, he had already seen his father in the crowd. He immediately shouted excitedly, "Papa! Papa!" Seeing this, Chun-Shi immediately smiled and waved at him, then quickly walked to Qin Ruoying's side. When Chun-Shi came over, the little boy immediately reached out his hands and motioned for Chun-Shi to hold him. This action was very common, but the slightly different thing was that when the little boy saw his father this time, his cute little face did not show much of a smile. She was obviously frightened. Like a frightened ostrich, as soon as the little boy came into Chun-Shi's arms, he immediately leaned his head on Chun-Shi's shoulder. Chapter 260. The little girl was scared out of her wits because Auntie Zhang had just taught her a lesson by scaring her. Although the little girl was scared and seemed to be traumatized, Chun-Shi didn't think there was anything wrong with Auntie Zhang's behavior. After all, if she didn't pay attention to education in this area, it would be too late for regrets when the child was taken away by human traffickers. Although that was basically impossible, setting an alarm bell in Yin Yin's heart in advance was always a precautionary measure. Human trafficking had always been the most serious topic of this era. Behind it was the dark side of civilized society. Why did human traffickers like to abduct children under the age of 5? It wasn't just because children were easy to deceive, but because children couldn't remember things. After 2 or 3 years, they basically didn't recognize their biological parents. Instead, they would treat the family that adopted them as their closest relatives. After many years, even if the child had a little bit of memory before they were abducted, it was usually just fragmented fragments and not enough for them to recall the complete experience. Ordinary people might feel that this kind of thing was far away from them, so whenever they saw news about it, they felt like they were listening to a book from heaven and had no interest in it at all. But all of this was actually close at hand. According to statistics, there were as many as 20,000 cases of human trafficking of women and children in the country in 2015, but the number of cases that were solved was only 3,000. The solving rate was only 17%, not even 20%. And behind these simple numbers, there were families that were shattered because of the loss of their children, as well as parents who were devastated. Human traffickers didn't need to be ruthless like the underworld, so they usually looked ordinary. They might be kind aunties passing by on the street corner, or they might be honest farmers. But under those seemingly harmless skins, there was a cold and cruel heart. Therefore, in Chun-Shi's view, there were 2 kinds of behavior in this world that could be called heinous and could be directly shot once caught. And that was drug dealers and human traffickers. The Western region had always been the disaster area of human trafficking cases. Although Chengdu had successfully become a new first-tier city in recent years, this kind of thing was still a common occurrence. Auntie Zhang's goal of educating the child had been achieved, so she waved her hand and asked everyone to go home. During this time, she pursed her lips and didn't say a single word. In fact, whether it was Aunt Zhang or the onlookers, they could only feel a deep sense of helplessness at the same time. This also caused the atmosphere at the entrance of the residential area to be very oppressive. The old couple who had lost their child sat on the ground and cried miserably. That pitiful look really made people feel sad. After all, they were all people with children. As long as they imagined that their child was lost, that feeling of despair and helplessness would immediately surge into their hearts. He truly felt the same way. The police quickly understood what had happened, so they wanted to invite the two elders back to the police station to start the investigation. But just as they were about to help the old couple leave, the old lady, whose tears had dried up from crying, suddenly staggered and covered her chest with her hands. Then she suddenly fell on her back. This sudden turn of events was like a splash of water falling into a pot of oil, causing an uproar among the crowd. Call 120. Grandma Lou fainted. Does anyone know anything about medicine? Come and take a look. Big Sister Lou's heart is not good. Is it a heart attack? Her medicine? Quick, someone get the medicine from her house. Everyone make way. She's having a heart attack. We need to maintain ventilation. Do any of you know where her house is? The patient's house should have a quick-acting heart rescue pill. Go and look for it. I know. I'll go get it. Master Lee, give me the house key. Where's Big Sister Lou's medicine? I'll go get it for her. The police hurriedly performed cardiopulmonary resuscitation on the old man while yelling and assigning tasks to the onlookers. After hearing that there might be medicine in the old lady's house, a middle-aged man quickly squeezed to the old couple's side and asked the old man to give him the house key. However, the old man was already panicking. He trembled as he searched his body, but he couldn't find the house key after a while. It seemed like he had completely forgotten where he had put the key. Seeing that he couldn't find the key, the old man was anxious and scared. He cried on the spot. I can't find it, I can't find it. I don't know where I put the key. Seeing this, the middle-aged man turned around and ran. As he ran, he shouted, Come with me and smash the door. After hearing the middle-aged man's words, the old man's face became even more sorrowful. He cried at the top of his lungs, You can't smash it open. My house has a burglar-proof door. The old man lived on the first floor, so the burglar-proof doors and windows were reinforced. He didn't expect that it would become his wife's death warrant. How could he not feel despair? An old man in his 60s or 70s was now like a child who couldn't find his home. He could only sit on the ground and cry helplessly. These heavy blows one after another had obviously caused the old man to completely collapse. Just as the scene was in chaos, a calm voice suddenly sounded from behind the police. Police comrade, I'm a doctor from Huaxi's cardiovascular department. Can you let me take a look at the situation? Hearing this, the police who were performing CPR on the old man was overjoyed. He immediately stood up and shouted, Come, doctor, come and take a look. This doctor who came like timely rain was obviously Chun-Shi. Based on the old man's current situation, it should not be a simple heart attack. It should be a myocardial infarction caused by excessive stimulation. To explain it in professional terms, the old man's emotional agitation caused his blood pressure to rise sharply. The burden on the left ventricle was obviously increased, the secretion of catecholamines increased, the demand for oxygen and blood in the myocardium increased, and the coronary artery was obviously insufficient, resulting in myocardial infarction and sudden cardiac arrest. Myocardial infarction was an extremely dangerous state. It could be said to be half a step into the gates of hell. The golden time for rescue usually did not exceed 30 seconds. The two police officers present had only learned some simple first aid skills, so they could not see the seriousness of the problem at all. They did not even realize the old man's heart had stopped beating. Chun-Shi squatted beside the old man and pretended to pinch the old man's philtrum. Only then did he quietly release his true vitality. He used true vitality to inject oxygen into the old man's brain and wrap the old man's heart with his true vitality. After that, Chun-Shi controlled his true vitality and began to slowly squeeze the old man's heart, forcibly simulating the state of the old man's normal heartbeat. Thump thump thump. Finally, Chun-Shi's efforts were not in vain. After about 2 minutes, the old man lying on the ground suddenly frowned and then coughed violently. Seeing this, the surrounding crowd suddenly burst into a burst of loud cheers. Chapter 261. Seeing that her father had saved someone, the expression on the little girl's face suddenly became triumphant. Everyone praised Chunxi loudly. After a few polite and modest words, Chunxi retreated to the back of the crowd with Yingying and Niannian. His appearance was like a sudden ray of light in the darkness. Even if the old man was half a step into the gates of hell, Chunxi still managed to save the old man very smoothly. In the news, it was often seen that the old lady would suddenly die shortly after she had a dispute with others. A large part of the reason was that the old lady's heart was not good. If she was not careful and was stimulated, she could die of sudden cardiac death. The police were also frightened by the old lady's physical condition, so they did not dare to ask them to go back to the police station now. They could only wait for the ambulance to come and send the old lady to the hospital for a checkup. However, even though the old lady was lucky to survive, the first thing she did after waking up was to look at the crowd and cry, "Where is my granddaughter? Where is my granddaughter?" When the old man saw his wife's sad look, he could not help but feel sad. The old couple immediately hugged each other and cried bitterly. The old lady was so pitiful. This also made Qin Ruoying feel kind. So she gently tugged at Chunxi's clothes and asked in a low voice, "Can you help them?" Chunxi turned his head and saw his wife's slightly expectant gaze. He could not help but nod. But then he frowned slightly. After all, it was very troublesome to find a person in a vast sea of people. If it were not for his sister-in-law taking the initiative to come to him, Chunxi might not have found Qin Ruoying until now. So he was also aware of the difficulties. However, this kind of thing happened in front of him. Seeing the old lady's pitiful appearance, Chunxi still felt a little sorry for her. So he made up his mind to find their child for them. As for how to find her, he had to think about it carefully. So, Chunxi came to the security room and asked to see the surveillance video. Because he had just saved the old lady, the security guard's attitude towards him was very friendly. Almost as soon as Chunxi suggested his idea, the security guard began to retrieve the surveillance footage for him. "I saw that woman come in. She was riding a battery-powered scooter. She should be in her 40s or 50s, but it was just a glimpse, so I can't remember clearly." "Do you have a picture of the child?" "Yes, this is a recent photo of the doll. Uncle Lee just showed this to the police. I saved a copy, and I'm going to put up a missing person notice on the door later." Chunxi looked at the child's photo carefully. After memorizing the child's appearance, he nodded and said to the security guard, "Okay, I'll go out and ask my friends to help me see if there are any clues about the child." After seeing the surveillance camera and the child's photo from the security guard, Chunxi returned to Qin Ruoying's side. When the little fellow heard that her father was going to help find someone, she immediately pulled a long face and cheered for Chunxi righteously. "Papa, you can do it. I'll wait for you at home." Well, this little thing now knows how to help others. However, finding someone was not as simple as what was shown in the movies. It was possible to hack into the Skynet system, and then use a computer to scan and compare. Although this operation was feasible to a certain extent, the success rate was far lower than imagined. After all, as long as it was not an impulsive crime, the criminals would definitely check out the place in advance, and try to avoid the surveillance cameras when committing the crime. They would also disguise themselves to a certain extent. Although Chunxi's divine sense had recovered a little, the range was still too small. The scanning radius of only more than 10 meters was not even as far as he could see directly with his eyes. Because the injury to his divine sense had not fully recovered, Chunxi could not use search spells such as bloodline tracking or divine sense searching. Now, it was really too difficult for him to find a child who had been abducted and sold in a city with an area of more than 800 square kilometers and a resident population of more than 10 million. However, although it was difficult, since he had promised Yingying that he would help the old lady, Chunxi would try his best to do it. He would just take it as accumulating good karma for himself. Although he could not directly find out the whereabouts of the human traffickers, Chunxi could use his own reasoning to find them. How to reason? It was actually very simple. First of all, the left turn out of the neighborhood was Wuho Temple Street, and the right turn was the alley where Chunxi had landed on his way back. After the human traffickers had deceived the child, it was impossible for them to run to the main street, so the alley without cameras was the only choice. The child was about the same age as Nian. At the age of 4, the child already had his own consciousness. Once the child found out that he had been deceived, he would definitely cry and make a fuss. Therefore, the human traffickers would not choose to leave Chengdu by bus or train. They must have their own means of transportation, and it was very likely that it was a cheap and affordable van or a second-hand car. Of course, if the human traffickers did not have a means of transportation, it would be easier. They would definitely temporarily put the child in a stronghold, and then contact a car for transportation. Time was another key clue. From the time the child went missing until now, it had not been more than an hour. In just a short hour, a human trafficker who had successfully abducted a child would not dare to take the child through the streets and alleys, and wander around the main streets of Chengdu. Therefore, the child was now either in a stronghold nearby, or in a van that was heading out of the city. Thinking of this, Chunxi immediately called Qin Xueqing. After briefly explaining the matter to his sister-in-law, Qin Xueqing immediately replied on the other end of the phone, "Yes, I will immediately arrange for people to set up surveillance checks on all the roads out of the city." Speaking of this, Qin Xueqing did not forget to remind him, "However, you better not have too much hope for this kind of fishing operation. It's okay, as long as you do your best." After asking his sister-in-law to help set up surveillance checks on the roads, Chunxi carefully searched the nearby slums. If the child was not in the van, then he must be nearby. However, when he was searching, Chunxi did not have any intention of asking people on the streets. The reason was very simple. Not everyone was like him. Even if a human trafficker passed by the shop owner with the child, the shop owner would not necessarily remember that he had seen such a person before. After all, in daily life, unless one was bored to death, who would deliberately remember the appearance of a passerby? Chunxi flew in the sky and carefully observed the environment of the streets below. In recent years, the buildings in Chengdu had been getting taller and taller, but there were still many slums that had not been renovated within the second ring road. Aunt Zhang's house was in an old neighborhood, so although there was a bustling Wuho temple outside the neighborhood, there was a large slum area that was waiting to be renovated behind it. The living conditions in the slums were poor, and the rent was low. Most of the people who lived here were foreigners who came to Chengdu to work. Chunxi flew slowly in the sky, and at the same time, he constantly observed the distribution of the nearby cameras. He could only rely on his intuition to find the child. After all, human traffickers were also a kind of head-killing business. It was not because of the law, but because once they were caught by the people, they could be beaten to death by angry people. Therefore, from the perspective of a human trafficker, they naturally had to hide in a secluded and safe place, and there were definitely not many cameras near that place. Chunxi studied for a while, then chose an old tube-shaped apartment, and then directly flew to the roof of the apartment. Then he took out the soul crystal from his pocket. Chapter 262. The tube-shaped apartment was a unique product of the 70s and 80s. This kind of house was like a student dormitory today. There was a long corridor connecting many single rooms, each of which was about 10 square meters. The living environment in the tube-shaped apartment was very poor, and because it had been in disrepair for many years, most of it had become dangerous. The owners basically looked forward to urban renovation and demolition all day long. Since the living conditions were so bad, it was obvious that the rent was very cheap. Perhaps because the new year had just started, most of the migrant workers were still in their hometown and had not returned to the city to work, so there were not many residents in this tube-shaped apartment. Chunxi sat cross-legged on the rooftop, then held the soul crystal in his hand. He wanted to use the soul crystal to expand the range of his divine sense, so that he could carefully search the shantytown. If he couldn't find it, then he could only put all his hopes on his sister-in-law. Although she was not his child, he had already promised to help the old man find his child, so Chunxi naturally had to do his best. Therefore, after a simple adjustment, Chunxi calmed his breath, then drove his divine sense into the soul crystal. The moment his divine sense entered the soul crystal, Chunxi seemed to have become a dolphin, and began to spread his divine sense outward in a way similar to using sonar. What was divine sense? It was a way of perception that transcended the five senses, somewhat similar to the legendary sixth sense. Even if Chun-Shi closed his eyes, with him as the center, everything within a radius of hundreds of meters was under his control. A world in a flower, a Bodhi in a leaf. Within the range of his divine sense, he could immediately detect the slightest movement of everything in the world. Even the tiny flies in the gutter, or the earthworms hidden in the soil, no matter how well they hid, could not escape Chun-Shi's discerning eyes. This was divine sense. The tube-shaped apartment was a dormitory that the public institution had assigned to the employees in the past. There were a total of 3 buildings, covering an area of about 2,000 square meters. With the enhancement of the soul crystal, Chun-Shi scanned the 3 buildings almost instantly. Good Lord, this scan is amazing. Chun-Shi was now on the rooftop of Building 1, and there was actually a corpse hidden in the building below him. Why was it hidden? It was because the corpse was sealed with cement in the bathroom at the end of the corridor. The toilets and bathrooms in the apartment were all shared. The body was under the sink in the bathroom, sealed inside with cement and bricks. In addition to the corpses, there were also many drugs hidden in these 3 buildings. Presumably, there were many drug addicts living here. It had to be said that Chun-Shi had found the right place. This place could be said to be filthy and filthy. It should be flattened with a cannonball. In addition to the corpses and drugs, in an inconspicuous room at the corner of the top floor of building number 3, Chun-Shi found more than a dozen children who were hidden by the human traffickers. Among these children, the youngest should only be 1 or 2 years old, and the oldest should be 6 or 7 years old. In addition to the children, there was also a girl who was about 16 or 17 years old. It was obvious that these human traffickers had abducted humans as well as children. How long had it been since the Chinese New Year? Looking at the situation, these bastards must have made a fortune during the Chinese New Year. After all, according to the market price, the total value of these children and young girls added up to more than 700,000 yuan. According to the Central Guang Night News, according to different statistics, the number of missing children in Wuxia every year was about 200,000, and only 0.1% of them were found. If calculated according to the average market price, then this was really an industry with a production value of over 100 million yuan. The granddaughter of the old couple was called Ting Ting. Because Nian Nian had just come to Aunt Zhang's house, she had not played with Ting Ting yet. Ting Ting was among the children. Perhaps it was because she had just arrived, but she was in good spirits and was struggling particularly hard. The children were abducted, so the human traffickers naturally would not provide them with good food and drinks. In the eyes of the human traffickers, these children were valuable goods, so in addition to tying the children's hands and feet firmly with ropes, the human traffickers also used towels to gag their mouths. The children were lying on the ground crookedly. Even if they could not speak, they still kept making woo-woo sounds out of fear, because they cried so hard. One of the children's eyes were so swollen that only a slit was left. This scene made Chun-Shi very uncomfortable. After all, he also had children. If someone tied Nian Nian up and threw her on the ground like this, he really could not imagine what a father would do in a rage. Therefore, the moment he saw this scene, Chun-Shi expressionlessly withdrew his divine sense, then got up and flew to building number 3. There was only one adult in the room, a woman in her 30s. The woman seemed to be in a good mood. At this moment, she was squatting next to the pitiful young girl, and holding the young girl's chin with one hand, and taking photos with her phone with the other. Looking at this situation, she seemed to want to sell this young girl for a good price. Chun-Shi flew to the top of the room where the children were locked up, but he did not immediately act. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the rooftop. He was waiting for the woman's accomplice to come back. As a family, the most important thing was to be neat. Chun-Shi sat patiently on the rooftop. It was not until around 6 o'clock in the evening that the woman's accomplice came back one by one. When all the human traffickers gathered on the first floor to prepare for dinner, Chun-Shi realized that this human trafficking organization was much bigger than he thought. They rented this building, and it seemed that there were at least 20 to 30 people, men and women, old and young. Among them, the youngest should be around 20 years old. They should all be from the same village, earning money together and committing crimes together. They usually lived in this cheap tube-shaped building, and then they would wander around in groups of 3 to 5 in the name of working. Once they found a target, they would start to plan the operation. Some were responsible for scamming, some were responsible for robbing, and some were responsible for keeping watch, scouting, and logistics. Although they were small, they had all the essentials. Among these children, some were caught before the new year, but they did not choose to ship the goods during the new year. Instead, they chose to ship the goods after the new year. Moreover, when they shipped the goods, they divided them into several batches to avoid being caught by the police. They were very experienced in committing crimes. Chunshi was also very patient, and waited quietly for more than 3 hours. It was not until 10 o'clock in the evening when 8 or 9 people came back that he stood up and slowly stretched. It should be about time. Chapter 263. In order to avoid alerting the enemy, Chunshi could only wait silently on the rooftop. He sat cross-legged and looked up at the night sky of Chengdu. He felt that the tears of the children had seeped through the walls and soaked the floor. He looked at the group of people gathered under the apartment building. Under the light, they were not human at all, but evil spirits that wandered the dark side of society. Because they had been tied up for a long time, the parts of the children that were bound by the rope had begun to have edema. When Chunshi saw this scene, he could not help but feel sorry for these children. How old were these children? They were treated like livestock. How much damage would this cause to the children's young hearts? As a human being, at the very least, Chunshi did not see any kindness in these human traffickers. Many people always wondered why the human traffickers had their own families. They worked hard just to better take care of their families, but they still did such a heartless thing. In fact, the reason was very simple. In everyone's eyes, children were gifts given to them by God. But in the eyes of human traffickers, children were just goods that could be sold for money. Children were pure and beautiful, and every one of them was so cute. It was not an exaggeration to say that which child was not more likable than Yin Yin? For the parents of children, their children were obviously the most precious treasures in the world. In order to catch these bastards in one fell swoop, Chunshi waited for a long time, but he also let these poor children suffer for a few more hours of torture in vain. But fortunately, all of this should end. Like a phantom in the dark, Chunshi's figure suddenly disappeared from the rooftop. When he reappeared, he was already outside the door of the room on the top floor where the children were locked up. It was still the woman in her 30s who was guarding the children. And why was the man not allowed to guard the children? Obviously, it was because there was a little girl here. As a man, there were always times when he could not control himself. This little girl was going to be sold for money. If she was accidentally broken, who would be willing to spend money to buy her? Therefore, in human trafficking organizations, it was usually women who guarded the goods. The door was not locked, and the woman was sitting on a chair not far from the door. She was watching a TV series on her phone. The moment Chunshi pushed the door open, the woman heard the sound of the door opening. However, she seemed to be engrossed in watching, so she didn't even raise her head as she spoke in a rather difficult dialect. Chunshi didn't pay attention to her, but looked at the children sitting on the ground. It was probably because they were tired from crying that the children were already asleep. Only the little girl who heard the sound of Chunshi opening the door immediately raised her head and looked outside vigilantly. There was only an old light bulb in the room. Under the dim light, the sudden appearance of a strange man made the girl shrink back in fear. The little girl's movements made a rustling sound. After hearing this sound, the woman in the room finally raised her head impatiently and directly shouted in Chunshi's direction. She thought it was a pervert who wanted to take advantage of this little girl. This kind of thing happened more than once, so she didn't care at all, but she didn't expect that after looking up, she found that she didn't know the man in front of her at all. The woman was stunned. She was stunned for a second or two. Then, her eyes suddenly widened, and she was about to scream. But at the moment when she was about to scream, Chunshi suddenly stretched out his arm, and the invisible true spirit suddenly clasped the woman's neck like an iron hoop. Want to call for help? The two were at least 2 meters apart. Chunshi just grabbed in the air, and the woman was suddenly lifted from the chair by him like a chicken. The pressure on her neck made the woman almost suffocated, but she still opened her eyes and mouth, trying to make a sound. Seeing this, Chunshi said calmly, "I'll help you." After the voice fell, Chunshi gently waved his arm. The woman's body was like a marionette. Under the pull of an invisible force, she instantly broke the window and flew directly out of the 5th floor. Then the question came. How long would it take for an object to fall freely from the height of a 5-story building to fall to the ground? The answer was, with a muffled sound from downstairs, the entire apartment was alarmed. Like a sudden power outage in the student apartment, screams and footsteps suddenly came from downstairs. This scene happened in front of the little girl, but she stared with her red eyes, as if she didn't come back to her senses at all. Seeing her silly look, Chunshi couldn't help but smile at her. Then he gently snapped his fingers. "Go to sleep, you'll be fine when you wake up." Under the effect of the meditation spell, the little girl leaned weakly against the wall, and her consciousness became more and more blurred. She tried hard to remember the appearance of the man in front of her, but the strong sleepiness made her instantly fall asleep. After the little girl fell asleep, Chunshi turned his head to look at the child in the room. After cutting all the ropes with his true essence, he turned and walked out of the room. 30 to 40 people ran wildly in the apartment, and the floor made a bang-bang sound as they stepped on it. Listening to the gradually approaching footsteps, Chunshi sighed rather helplessly. It would be great if he could just slaughter all of these scumbags, but he couldn't do that. Because this kind of large-scale human trafficking organization had abducted and sold countless children, he couldn't kill all of these bastards for a moment of pleasure. He had to leave some alive for the police to find the children they had abducted before. After all, there were so many broken families who were still holding on to a glimmer of hope that they could find their children, even if they had to use up all their wealth. What a pity! And just as Chunshi stood in the corridor thinking about how to deal with these human traffickers, the fastest among them had already rushed in front of him with steel pipes and kitchen knives. Seeing this, Chunshi's face couldn't help but darken, and he suddenly made a decision in his heart. In terms of probability, when an earthquake happened, there would always be a few lucky people in a building who would be able to survive. In that case, let God decide who would die and who would live. So just as the few men were about to rush in front of Chunshi fiercely stepped on the floor of the corridor. A huge force suddenly went from the roof to the foundation, and almost instantly shook the load-bearing walls of the entire building. Just like an earthquake, the entire building was like a building that had been crushed, and it quickly collapsed amidst the dust that filled the air. At the same time, Chunshi used his true essence to wrap the little girl and the children. After putting the children on the street outside the apartment, Chunshi called his sister-in-law's phone. The apartment collapsed, but the number of lucky survivors was beyond Chunshi's imagination. This also made him sigh. These bastards' luck was actually so good? Did the heavens have eyes? So when he ended the call with his sister-in-law, Chunshi didn't forget to repeatedly remind her. Death penalty, it must be the death penalty, remember. Good will be rewarded with good, evil with evil. If there is no justice in heaven, I will. Chapter 264. The next morning, the whole family was sitting around the dining table, happily eating breakfast. At this moment, the morning news suddenly broadcasted a news flash. Last night, the Chengdu police cracked a huge case of baby trafficking. They arrested 37 suspects and rescued 16 babies. The reporter has called the person in charge of the case, but as the case is still under investigation, the specific details cannot be disclosed for the time being. Then the TV screen cut to the Wuhou branch. Many parents were anxiously waiting outside the conference room. After receiving the police summons, the parents rushed into the conference room and began to frantically search for their children. Only 16 children were rescued, but there were hundreds of parents present. After all, the police didn't know which family these children belonged to. Therefore, they could only invite the parents who had recently lost their children to come over and hold such a family reunion. The old couple was quite lucky. The first thing they saw after entering was their granddaughter, Tingting. The two elders quickly walked to Tingting. When they saw the abrasions and edema on the child's body, the old couple could not help but cry on the spot. These were tears of joy, and at the same time, the joy of surviving a disaster. The old couple hugged their granddaughter and cried for a long time. After their emotions had calmed down, they went to the side and began to register under the guidance of the police. The image came to an abrupt end. The camera cut back to the live broadcast room. After a few simple comments, the host smiled and began to broadcast the next piece of news. News always reported the good news and not the bad news. And this reunion was no less than a second blow to the parents who had lost their children. It was fine if they found them, but what if they could not? As the saying goes, the greater the expectation, the greater the disappointment. They came to the reunion with unlimited expectations, but in the end, they could only watch as others found their children, while their own children were still nowhere to be found. How strong did one have to be able to endure such endless torment? Therefore, at the end of the reunion, it would always be filled with the cries of despair of the parents. Those who heard it would be sad and those who heard it would cry. Such a scene was naturally not suitable to appear in the news. As a bystander, Aunt Zhang, like most people, did not delve into the details. Therefore, when she saw the old couple find Tingting on TV, she couldn't help but laugh and say, "It's good that you found her, it's good that you found her." Speaking of this, Aunt Zhang did not forget to reach out and pat the little girl's head. Then she pretended to be serious and said to her, "Nian Nian, if you don't listen to me in the future, Grandma will sell you to human traffickers. What do you think?" Hearing Auntie Zhang's words, the little boy was frightened and immediately shook his head like a rattledrum. He pouted and said loudly, "No, you're not allowed to sell me." As it spoke, the little thing burrowed into Qin Ruoying's arms. Aunt Zhang couldn't help but laugh out loud at the silly look on his face. "Silly child, Grandma is just teasing you. You are so cute, how could Grandma be willing to sell you?" Qin Ruoying comforted her with a smile. Hearing this, the little fellow pouted and snorted, and then expressed its strong dissatisfaction. Children also have human rights. Breakfast ended in such a happy atmosphere. After Kai Shuqin and Xie Pinglin left for work, Aunt Zhang packed up and prepared to bring Chen Shi's family out to play. However, because she still had to take care of her granddaughter, Aunt Zhang was busy for a while and didn't finish packing. During this time, Chen Shi discussed with Qin Ruoying softly. The new year was over, so it was about time for them to leave. They couldn't always stay at Aunt Zhang's house and freeload on food and drinks, right? Therefore, after a brief discussion, Chen Shi brought up their plans to Auntie Zhang. After leaving Chengdu, they would go to Zhonghai for a few days to reminisce about the past before returning to Shangjing. After returning to Shangjing, they couldn't let the little girl play so carefree anymore. They had to find a kindergarten for her and let her become a preschool child. This time, she would study seriously in a big class, unlike the past where she would slack off. Therefore, Chen Shi and Qin Ruoying didn't discuss with the little girl at all, and directly decided everything for her. Although Aunt Zhang was very reluctant, after hearing the detailed plan, she still agreed to it. However, they could leave, but they had to wait until the new year. Since Aunt Zhang had already said so, the husband and wife naturally couldn't go against her wishes, so they followed the old lady's wishes and stayed with her for a few more days until the Lantern Festival. After that, the family went out and prepared to take advantage of the last few days to play all over Chengdu. It had to be said that the internet era was indeed convenient for people's lives. After Chen Shi rented a shared car with his phone, he drove the family happily to Huanglongxi. Chengdu couldn't be compared to Shangjing. There were only a few scenic spots to play in, and Huanglongxi was a relatively good vacation spot in the surrounding area. However, since Chen Shi came back, he took the little girl to see 5 scenic spots. In addition, she lived in Hohai for a long time, so naturally, she had a certain immunity to this kind of retro old street, and didn't have the slightest interest. Therefore, after wandering around aimlessly for a while, she clamored to find another place to play. Chen Shi had no choice but to drive her around. It wasn't until Qin Ruoying found out that there was a marine park nearby that the little girl's big eyes finally lit up again. The scale of this marine park wasn't large, but the little girl had never been to a place like this before. After all, there was no harm without comparison. This also made her very happy. Along the way, she pointed at the fish in the water tank and asked questions. "Why is this fish so big? Why does this fish have feet? Why is this fish glowing? Her understanding of marine life was still limited. As long as it lived in the water, it was a fish. This trip was quite pleasant. Before leaving, Chen-Chi bought the little girl a dolphin pillow, which made her smile from ear to ear. Out of the aquarium, there was a shopping mall not far away. When the little girl held Qin Ruoying's hand and waited outside for Chen-Chi to drive out, she suddenly noticed the shared bicycle next to them. Shared bicycle. She still didn't know how to ride a bicycle. Hohai streets were small, so it was rare to see shared bicycles riding here. Now that she suddenly saw so many shared bicycles, it immediately made the little girl envious. Mama, I want to ride this. Looking at everyone riding the shared bicycle, the little girl pouted on the spot and acted coquettishly. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying said to her with an awkward face, "No, you're still young. You can't ride this. This is not for children to ride." "I want to ride this. I want to ride this." Seeing that Qin Ruoying didn't agree, the little girl immediately withdrew her hands and ran to one of the bicycles. After Chen-Chi drove the car out of the parking lot, the mother and daughter were still whispering, discussing, next to the shared bicycle. Chapter 265. Chen-Chi drove the car out of the parking lot. Just as he turned the corner, he saw the mother and daughter who were discussing. The wife was dignified, elegant, and charming. The daughter was innocent, lively, and cute. For a father, this scene might be the most beautiful scene in the world. Qin Ruoying didn't notice that Chen-Chi had already driven the car out. She was still trying to persuade the little guy to give up riding the bicycle. However, the little guy was now completely carried away. He didn't listen to his mother's words as usual. Seeing that his mother didn't help him, the little guy ran to find a small yellow bicycle, and then stood aside thinking about how he should sit on it. The yellow bicycle was the shortest bike in the shared bicycle, but even if the saddle was the shortest, it wasn't something a 5-year-old child could play with. Looking at the pedestrians coming and going on the shared bicycle, the little guy directly sat on the horizontal tube in the middle of the yellow bicycle. Then he raised his hands and tightly grabbed the handles on both sides. In fact, it wasn't right to say that it was a horizontal tube, because the yellow bicycle was a low-span bicycle. This kind of shape was generally configured for women's bicycles, and women's bicycles naturally couldn't have a large horizontal bar like the old bicycle, so even a child of a few years old could easily ride it. Of course, the premise was that the child could ride a bicycle. After the little guy strained his legs over the horizontal tube, he sat on the horizontal tube, and then used his 2 short legs to step on the ground and tried to move the bicycle. Not to mention that the bicycle wasn't unlocked. Even if the lock was unlocked, whether the little guy could hold on and not let the bicycle fall was a problem. So for a child, the shared bicycle really wasn't a toy, but was very likely to be a weapon. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying could only sigh deeply, and then the expression on her face became serious for the first time. It seemed that he was going to flip out. She was also forced to have no choice. After all, in front of the child, one had to play the good cop, and the other had to play the bad cop, right? Chen-Chi spoiled the little guy so much, so the annoying thing of playing the bad cop was not only done by her. Qin Ruoying, who had always been dignified and elegant, was now going to flip out at the child on the street. Presumably, this was one of the compulsory lessons for the goddess after she became a married woman. However, just when Qin Ruoying was about to flip out, a horn suddenly sounded from the street next to them. Qin Ruoying looked back and saw that Chen-Chi had already driven to their side. After seeing Qin Ruoying's helpless expression, Chen-Chi immediately understood what had just happened. So he quickly rolled down the window, and then shouted at the little guy who was still trying to ride. "Nian Nian Nian Nian, do you want to go to heaven?" After hearing his father's call, the little thing immediately looked up at Chen-Chi and grinned. "Papa, this is fun. I want to ride." As she spoke, she twisted the bell on the bike, but the more she twisted it, the more energetic she became. At this time, Aunt Zhang, who was sitting in the back, could not stand it anymore, so she said to Chen-Chi, "Why aren't you going to carry her back? Look at how you've spoiled her." Chen-Chi was inexplicably scolded, and he did not know whether to laugh or cry. Just when Chen-Chi opened the door and got off, Aunt Zhang did not forget to remind him, "Be careful, don't let her fall." It could be seen that Grandma really had a sharp tongue but a soft heart for her granddaughter. After giving Qin Ruoying a look, Chunxi quietly went behind the little guy, and then, when she was not paying attention, he lifted her up by her armpits. If it was in the past, the little guy would be overjoyed to be ambushed by her father, but today, she might be relying on this shared bike. Therefore, when she realized that she was being carried away by her father, the little guy burst into tears on the spot. Before Papa and Mama got angry, the little guy was the first to flip out. The sudden crying almost scared Chunxi, so he quickly touched the back of her head and comforted her. "Wu, Nian, don't cry, don't cry. You're so young so you can't ride a shared bike. Papa will ride with you in the future, okay?" Hearing this, the little guy cried even louder. What should they do? The couple could not help but look at each other, and neither of them hardened their hearts to play the role of the good cop. At this time, it was natural for the elderly to step in. Aunt Zhang asked Chunxi to put the little guy in the back, then she quietly communicated with the little guy. "Don't cry, if you cry again, I'll sell you to human traffickers. Nian, look at you now, you're not likable anymore. Do you still remember what you told Grandma before? Isn't our Nian the most obedient and sensible? Be good, you have to listen to Papa and Mama. If you make Papa and Mama angry again, be careful that they throw you away again. Then you can only live with Grandma in the future." "What? You don't want to live with Grandma? Grandma is so sad, my granddaughter doesn't want me anymore." After all, she was a child that the elderly had personally raised. After a round of threats and temptations, Aunt Zhang managed to divert the little guy's attention to other places. The little guy did not even wipe his tears before he took the initiative to hug Aunt Zhang and said softly, "I want Grandma. Grandma is the best. The older, the wiser." Actually, it was possible to scare the child, but one must not use it as a tactic. After scaring the child to make him realize that he was wrong, it was necessary to divert the child's attention in time and let them temporarily forget what was in front of them. Otherwise, it was very likely that overdoing it would be as bad as not doing enough. If it was more serious, it could even cause a certain degree of psychological trauma to the child. Aunt Zhang educated the little guy in a low voice, but her words were passed to the couple's ears without missing a word. The couple sat in the front row. At some point, Chunxi's hand was no longer on the gear lever, but stretched out to the front passenger seat. The two silently felt the warmth from each other's palms. When the little guy's laughter sounded again, Qin Ruoying smiled and patted Chunxi's hand away, then pointed to the road ahead and said with a smile, "Drive carefully." "Okay, yes ma'am." The car was quiet, so Chunxi turned on the radio. Maybe it was set up by the previous tenant, so when it was turned on, it was the traffic radio channel. Pleasant music suddenly sounded in the car. This song could be considered a familiar Cantonese song. After listening to a sentence, Chunxi could not help but hum along with the radio. The little guy seemed to have completely forgotten the previous unhappiness, so when she heard Chunxi sing, she immediately laughed and clapped her hands. "Papa sings well. It's so good. How good is it? It's better than him. Little mouth is so sweet. Come, give Papa a mue." "What are you doing? You're driving. Pay attention to the road." For a moment, the car was full of the family's laughter. Hard to leave, I want to hold on tight. The vast life is like the wilderness, like a child can lean on his father's shoulder who wants to get off the car. There are always some things that are hard to leave. Common sense is so inescapable. No matter how cold the world is. Thinking of this bicycle, there is still happiness to be borrowed. Chapter 266. In the blink of an eye, it was March 2nd. It was the 15th day of the first lunar month, the Lantern Festival. The little girl did not like to watch the gala performances on TV, so the family went out together after dinner. Where were they going? Of course, they were going to enjoy the lanterns. The Lantern Festival began more than 2,000 years ago in the Han Dynasty, and had always been a major festival in Wuxia. According to the ancient customs, the new year was only truly over after the Lantern Festival. However, the pace of life was getting faster and faster. Even though the legal holiday stipulated that people would only go to work on the 7th day, many private enterprises still required people to start work on the 5th day. Among them, there were even more, such as the catering and entertainment industry. They might open for business on the eve of the new year, so the employees naturally could not rest. Such a pace of life directly led to the Lantern Festival, almost following in the footsteps of the Dragon Boat Festival. With the decline of the Lantern Festival, the lively scene described by Xin Chiji in Green Jade Case. Yuanxi was naturally no longer as lively as before. The east wind blossoms 1,000 trees, blowing down the stars like rain. The fragrance of precious horses and carts fills the road. The sound of feng xiao moves. The light of a pot turns. Fish and dragons dance in the night. Moths flutter in the wind, inging and laughing in the wind. He searched for her thousands of times in the crowd, but when he looked back, she was at the fire. Today was Friday. Although the public institutions were on holiday, most private enterprises still had to work tomorrow. In addition, everyone might be tired of playing during the new year, so the Wuhou Temple Street was not as lively as it was during the Spring Festival. After leaving the house, the family took a taxi and went straight to the Panda Lantern Festival. The moon on the 15th was full and round, but what was more dazzling than the moon was the colorful Lantern Festival. Because they set off late, by the time Qinshi and the rest arrived at the Lantern Festival, it was already a 10-mile-long street with brilliant lights. As soon as they got out of the car, the fragrance of magnolia drifted to the tip of everyone's nose in the breeze. The little girl sniffed the fragrance in the air and turned her head to see the entrance of the Lantern Festival. There were a few panda lanterns outside the Lantern Festival. Although they were ugly and cute, they made her shout excitedly, "Papa, look! Panda! Panda!" In fact, to this little girl, there was not much difference between going to the Lantern Festival and going to the zoo. She was dazzled by the colorful lanterns in all kinds of shapes and sizes. She chattered excitedly all the way. In Chunxi's eyes, this Lantern Festival was somewhat similar to the Earth Temple Fair. Other than strolling around, there was only eating, drinking and playing. However, what was worth praising was that the food in Chengdu was indeed much better than the food in Shangjing. The whole family ate and watched along the way. After admiring the lanterns, they watched the magic show. Finally, under the illumination of the fireworks, they sat in the car and went home with satisfaction. In the end, this trip to Chengdu was still very pleasant. The next morning, after breakfast, Chunxi pulled the little girl to his side and asked with a smile, "Nian, Daddy has already bought the plane tickets. We'll fly back to Zhonghai later and visit our old home, okay?" "All right." The little thing's eyes lit up at the mention of taking a plane. Seeing this, Chunxi struck while the iron was hot and said, "Then go and help your mother pack her things now. After she is done, we will set off." "Good. I'll go help Mama." Everything went smoothly. It wasn't until Chunxi changed the boarding pass and took her to say goodbye to Aunt Zhang that the little thing suddenly froze in place. After staring blankly for a long while, she suddenly came back to her senses. Was she going to say goodbye to her grandmother? She thought Aunt Zhang was going to go home with them. When Chunxi saw that the little girl's expression was a little strange, he immediately smiled and hugged her in his arms. He gently comforted her and said, "Nian, we should get on the plane. Hurry and say goodbye to your grandmother. We'll come to Chengdu to see her again in the future." Perhaps it was because this period of time together had aroused her dependence on Aunt Zhang, so when the little girl came back to her senses, she immediately said very angrily, "No, I'm not going. I want to go with my grandmother." This expression of anger rarely appeared on the little girl's face, so when Chunxi saw her expression, he was quite surprised. The little girl was angry and twisted her body to get out of his arms. Seeing this, Chunxi immediately hugged her tightly and didn't let her run away. But this hug was serious. After realizing that her freedom of life was restricted by her father, the little thing flipped out on the spot. "I'm not going. I'm not going. I want to go with my grandmother. My grandmother wants to go with us." As she shouted, her voice started to sound like she was about to cry. Following that, she burst into tears. Well, things were getting out of hand. The reason why the couple didn't tell the little girl in advance was that they were afraid that she would cry. But what would come would come. and they couldn't avoid it even if they wanted to. The reason why they wanted to leave was actually because of the same reason. Aunt Zhang had her own family, and their family was always outsiders. Naturally, they couldn't stay at Aunt Zhang's house for a long time. After all good things must come to an end. There were people coming and going at the ticket gate, and the little girl's sudden crying attracted a lot of attention. Chen-Shi had no choice but to take the little girl to a rest chair and let Aunt Zhang comfort her. This kind of thing had happened many times. It was normal for children to be clingy. So the family comforted the little girl one by one. Chen-Shi took out his phone and made a live video call with Aunt Zhang. He promised that he would bring her to Chengdu in the future, and only then did the little girl slowly stop crying. But she still didn't want to be separated from Aunt Zhang. She lay in her grandmother's arms without saying a word, as if she had been wronged. In the end, even the airport broadcast announced that they were boarding the plane. Only then did the little girl reluctantly wave goodbye to her grandmother with red eyes. Grandmother, we'll come to see you in the future. After watching the couple carrying the little girl gradually disappear into the distance, Aunt Zhang couldn't help but wipe the tears from the corners of her eyes. Although she wasn't her biological child, her love for Nian was very real. The plane took off. Perhaps it was because she had just cried, but the little girl didn't even have the interest to look at the clouds outside. She fell into a deep sleep. When she woke up again, the family had already returned to Zhonghai. The moment the cabin door opened, a salty sea breeze unique to coastal cities blew in. Unlike Chengdu and Shangjing, Zhonghai gave Chen-Shi the most unique feeling. But that feeling didn't come from the city itself, but from the people standing next to him at this moment. Chen-Shi carried the little girl. The moment he walked out of the gangway, he couldn't help but hold Qin Ruoying's hand. Zhonghai, we're back. Chapter 267. As soon as the family got off the plane and walked into the terminal, it began to drizzle. Just a moment ago, the sky was clear, but now it suddenly became drizzling. And this sudden spring rain seemed to be a ceremony to welcome the return of their family. Perhaps it was because she had slept on the plane, so when the little guy got off the plane, his lively and energetic appearance came back. Therefore, the little thing did not ask Chen-Shi to hold her. Instead, she jumped and ran in the corridor with her short legs. Seeing her excited look, the couple quickly followed behind her, hand in hand. If they ignored the little girl in front of them, the two of them now looked like a couple who came to Zhonghai for their honeymoon. It was impossible to tell that they were an old couple with a 5-year-old child. The little girl ran and jumped. After running for a while, she made a sharp turn and directly lay in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of the terminal. Then she looked at the planes in front of her and said excitedly, "Papa, look, that plane is running." Chen-Shi came to the little girl's side. After touching her head with a smile, he put his hand on her back and pushed her out step by step. While walking, Chen-Shi asked with a smile, "See, didn't you just get on the plane? How do you feel?" The little thing seemed to like being pushed by her father, so she leaned back and did not fall down because of the support of Chen-Shi's palm. Then she lay on Chen-Shi's palm. Then, under the push of Chen-Shi, like a master, she slowly walked forward with her short legs. "I like it. I like to fly." Looking at the bright smile on the little girl's face, Chen-Shi could not help but look at Qin Ruoying and smile. This child is so likable. The airport was so big that it took more than 10 minutes to walk out of the station. Even though there was a sidewalk elevator, the little thing was still tired of standing, so she turned around and raised her hands to Chen-Shi. Without needing her to say anything, Chen-Shi immediately squatted down and then hugged her in his arms. The higher one stood, the further one could see. Therefore, when she sat in Chen-Shi's arms, she pointed to exit 3 and asked in confusion, "Papa, what are they doing?" Chen-Shi looked in the direction the little fellow was pointing, and saw 2 rows of burly men in black suits standing in front of the gate of the number 3 exit. That murderous aura was like that of a gang welcoming their boss home at the entrance of a prison. "He should be here to pick me up." "What's that?" "Let me give you an example. Let's say you take a plane to Chengdu alone. Grandma is afraid that you won't be able to find your way, so she comes to the airport to pick you up in advance. This is called picking you up." Oh, The little fellow nodded as if she understood. Then she asked doubtfully, "Then who's coming to pick us up today?" "We don't need anyone to pick us up because we're going home now, not to Grandma's." Hearing this, the little fellow pouted and seemed to want to ask something, but Chunshi pinched her little face and decisively stopped this topic. Nowadays, stars like to pose for photos at the airport. As the fashion capital of Wuxia, there were stars coming to Zhonghai Airport to pose for photos every day. This also led to many fans waiting at the airport for a long time, just to take a photo with their favorite stars. At least 20 or 30 men in suits stood at the number 3 exit. There was a murderous aura there, which naturally made ordinary people dare not approach. Therefore, even though the other exits were about to be lined up, the number 3 exit was still a scene of sparrows. This abnormal situation also attracted the attention of a large number of professional fans. Although they did not dare to approach, they still carefully surrounded the number 3 exit with their mobile phones, wanting to see which big shot was coming. Chunshi's family was not people who liked to join in the fun, so after getting off the escalator, Chunshi and Qin Ruoying directly turned a corner and walked to the number 4 exit in front of them. At this moment, a voice suddenly sounded from behind them. "Mr. Chun, you're back?" Chunshi looked back and saw Su Wei with an old face running toward him with great enthusiasm. "Mr. Su, what are you doing?" "Hey, I just got off the plane and saw you, so I wanted to come over and say hello. After all, you're my savior." "Oh, okay, I've said hello, you can go do your thing." After that, Chunshi held the little fellow in one hand and Qin Ruoying in the other, and prepared to leave. When Su Wei saw his posture, he suddenly became anxious, so he quickly ran to him and continued to say, "Mr. Chun, you see, this is fate. You haven't called a taxi yet, right? Why don't you let me give you a ride?" While speaking, Su Wei bowed to Chunshi and made an inviting gesture. Chunshi stopped, but he did not look at Su Wei. Instead, he turned his head and looked behind him. Ning Zhonghua was standing not far behind him. After going through thick and thin together, these two brothers had actually become sworn brothers. After Ning Zhonghua saw Chunshi turn around, he immediately ran over, then smiled at Chunshi and said, "Mr. Chun, long time no see." Chunshi did not speak. Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei looked at each other quietly. Then, Ning Zhonghua reluctantly continued to smile and said, "I came to pick up old Su, but I didn't expect to meet you here. If it's convenient, why don't we give you a ride? What do you think?" Chunshi looked at the two of them calmly, then turned his head to look at Qin Ruoying. When he saw Qin Ruoying nod gently, Chunshi replied, "Okay, let's go. I'll give you a ride today." "That's great. Mr. Chun, this way please." Su Wei jumped up excitedly on the spot. He stretched out his left hand and bowed slightly at the same time, like a greeter welcoming an important guest. He quickly walked in front to lead the way for Chunshi. Wasn't the direction he was heading to exit 3? Su Wei led Chunshi's family to exit 3. At this time, 2 rows of big men in suits immediately bent down and bowed to Chunshi's family. At the same time, they shouted in unison, "Mr. Chun, hello." 20 to 30 big men in suits bowed in unison and shouted loudly. Almost instantly, they shocked the entire terminal and attracted the attention of the surrounding crowd. This scene, Chunshi didn't need to think to know that Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei had found out through their friends that he was going to fly back to Zhonghai, so they deliberately arranged such a show. The crowd was excited. After all, this was even more grand than when a celebrity made an appearance. Countless professional fans took out their phones and were ready to take photos. However, after the big men in suits bowed, they turned around and looked at the surrounding crowd, then stepped forward to stop them from taking photos. Chunshi frowned slightly, but he did not say anything. However, the little girl in his arms was excited. She was a child, so she always liked excitement. This kind of treatment really made her very excited, so she raised her small hand and waved to the surrounding crowd with a big laugh. Chapter 268. Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei were obviously treating them with the highest standards. Therefore, when Chunshi and his family walked out of Terminal 3 with Su Wei, the little girl was immediately attracted by the yellow Bentley in front of her. "Papa, this car is so long. It was no wonder that she was surprised. After all, the common 3-compartment cars on the streets were generally about 4.3 meters long, but the Mulsanne Grand in front of her was different. The length of the limousine was 6.57 meters, which was 2 meters longer than the average car. It naturally gave people a very shocking feeling from the side. The luxury car was extraordinary, so its price was naturally not trivial. The price of 35 million yuan was as high as a mansion driving on the road. Su Wei bought this car to receive important guests. After buying it, he had only used it a few times. Today, when he learned that Chen Shi was going back to Zhonghai, he immediately took out this treasure to please him. Of course, the price of this car was secondary. Tens of millions was just a drizzle for a tycoon of this level. The most important thing was that this car was limited to only 12 in the world, and there was only one in the entire Wuxia. Even if you had money, you couldn't buy it. Naturally, the price would increase. In order to win Chen Shi's favor, Su Wei used all of his tricks. He almost hung a banner at the entrance of the airport parking lot that said, "Welcome Mr. Chen to Zhonghai." Su Wei had completely transformed into a concierge now. He respectfully opened the door for Chen Shi's family. After Chen Shi's family got in the car, he wanted to get in as well. However, at this time, Chen Shi, who was sitting in the car, glanced at him indifferently. Su Wei was very smart. He almost instantly understood what Chen Shi meant, so he quickly found a way out of this situation. He smiled and said, "Mr. Chen, I won't disturb you, I'll sit in the back." After that, he gave Ning Zhonghua a look, and he ran to the Mercedes-Benz S-Class in the back. Because Ning Zhonghua and Chen Shi knew each other earlier compared to Su Wei, it was easier for Ning Zhonghua to talk to Chen Shi. However, there was an old saying, "Today is different from the past." After the two of them experienced a series of events, their attitude toward Chen Shi had naturally changed dramatically. It was a kind of respect from the bottom of their hearts, and it had nothing to do with age, experience, or social status. It was purely because Chen Shi was better than them. This alone was enough. With Ning Zhonggua's personality, he obviously wouldn't do something like this. However, after Su's suggestions, he finally nodded and agreed. After all, if he didn't agree, what should he do to continue to get closer to Chen? Beauty and money? Did Chen need? Therefore, sometimes it was very meaningful to put down one's face to flatter in front of the leader. As for those elegant people who thought they were virtuous and looked down on flattery, they actually fell into a misconception. They always thought that flatterers were incompetent people. In fact, flattery was a sign of high EQ, and it was also a common trait of successful people. After Su Wei left, Ning Zhonghua sat directly in the front passenger seat. In this luxury car, there was actually a partition between the front seat and the back seat. The back seat was completely a separate space, which was commonly known as the boss cabin. This was an extended version, and the back seat could sit 4 people, so it used a 4-seat design. Chen Shi and Qin Ruoying sat side by side, and the little girl climbed between the 2 seats opposite them. She seemed to be very interested in the layout of the car. From time to time, she would open and close the small table on the seat. She was having a lot of fun. At this time, Ning Zhonghua lowered the partition in the car, turned around and asked Chen Shi with a smile, "Mr. Chen, do you want to go home first or do you want to eat?" It was not even 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which was just the time for lunch. Su Wei and Ning Zhonghua spent so much effort just to treat Chen Shi's family to a meal. Hearing this, Chen Shi immediately turned his head and looked at Qin Ruoying. It was all up to his wife. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying first looked at the tall terminal through the window, then asked the little girl, "Nian Nian, are you hungry?" "I'm not hungry." The little girl was busy fiddling with the car refrigerator in the middle of the armrest, and she didn't even raise her head. After getting off the plane, she clamored for Chen Shi to buy her KFC. After eating a hamburger, she was naturally not hungry at all. Looking at the little girl who was tossing and turning in the opposite seat, Qin Ruoying thought for a moment, then suddenly smiled at Chen Shi and said, "It's still early. How about we go back to school?" Back to school? Chen Shi was stunned for a moment. He really didn't expect Qin Ruoying to want to go here after returning to Zhonghai. But after thinking about it, Chen Shi still understood Qin Ruoying's idea. So he smiled and said to Ning Zhonghua, President Ning, to Zhonghai University, sorry to trouble you. Perhaps because he was in a good mood, Qinxi's pleasant appearance at the moment made Ning Zhongguo feel flattered. He quickly replied happily, Okay, Mr. Qin, take a rest, we'll be there soon. Under the gray sky, a fleet of luxury cars drove from the airport to Zhonghai University. Because he didn't want to be too eye-catching, Qinxi asked the fleet to stop on the street some distance away from the school gate. Then he held the little girl in one hand and Qin Ruoying in the other, and the family of three slowly walked to the place that represented the beginning. Time flew by, and the years flew by. What a blissful year, fleeting past. Time did not leave any mark on the couple's faces. They were still young, except that they no longer had the innocence of their school days. Everything seemed to be the same as before. The little girl lay on Qinxi's shoulder and looked around. Her cute little appearance immediately attracted a lot of envious eyes. Ignoring the astonished gazes of the bystanders, the family of three leisurely walked on the forest path. That tree, that lake, that pavilion, that building, it seemed to be the same as it was 10 years ago. They wandered aimlessly around their alma mater. It was not until they came to the playground that Qinxi suddenly remembered the magnificent feat of covering the playground with roses. Qinxi would always remember that scene. In the sea of roses, Qin Ruoying, dressed in white, was like a beautiful butterfly. Under everyone's astonished eyes, she flew directly into his arms. That should be the most glorious moment of his life, right? Perhaps sensing the sudden smile on Qinxi's face, Qin Ruoying asked with a smile, What's wrong? Did you think of something good? Hearing this, Qinxi immediately squeezed her hand and asked with a smile, Isn't it all because of you? Is it? Isn't it? Are you blaming me? How is that possible? I can't wait to do it again. TSK, that feeling, it's great. Look at how happy you are. The couple sat in the stands and showed their affection unscrupulously while the little guy jumped around them. A football game was being held on the playground. The little guy imitated the other spectators and shouted cheers from time to time. He looked very excited. After sitting for a while, Qinxi suddenly hugged Qin Ruoying's slender waist, then looked into her eyes and asked with a little confusion, Yingying, actually I have a question to ask you. What's the question? Why did you like me in the first place? After hearing what he said, Qin Ruoying was stunned on the spot. She could not help but ask, Why do you ask that? Hearing this, Qinxi shook his head and sighed, I don't think I'm good enough for you. Of course, this sentence was not referring to the current him, but to the past him. Therefore, Qinxi had always been very puzzled. What kind of luck did he have to be favored by the goddess? Could it be, Qin Ruoying really had the ability to predict the future? Did she know that he had potential? Of course, Qin Ruoying did not have the ability to predict the future. Therefore, after hearing Qinxi's words, she could not help but smile. After reaching out and touching Qinxi's cheek, she said slightly mischievously, Then you have to ask Yulao, why did he put my red string on your hand? Then I have to go to Yulao's temple and burn incense to repay the vow. I have to thank him for giving me such a good wife. Fate was a kind of fate. The reason why the two of them were together was perhaps because fate had arranged for them to be together. And Qinxi obviously had not reached the level of being able to see through fate. You are as beautiful as a flower, and the years pass by like water. Answer. Or as leisurely and self-pity in the boudoir. Turn in front of the peony fence, close to the lake and the mountain rock. Loosen the collar button with you, the width of the shirt, the tips of the sleeves are ruffled, and the teeth are stained. Wait for you to endure and sleep tenderly for a while. It was that place where they had met before. Look at each other. It was difficult to say anything to each other. Chapter 269. March was rainy. In Zhonghai, a first-tier bustling city, one naturally could not feel the leisure of a small city in the south. The drizzling March seemed to have covered Zhonghai with a thin layer of gauze. The couple sat quietly in the stands of the sports field. In front of them was the football field brimming with youthful sweat, but behind them was the old building of the Republic of China. With such a profound background, it seemed to have covered their backs with a hint of loneliness and otherworldly charm. The hazy artistic conception of the misty Jiangnan could probably only be experienced in this beautiful campus. The little fellow could not feel the tranquil and distant artistic conception. Instead, she was completely attracted by the lively football game on the field. Although she did not even understand the rules of the football game, as long as the audience began to cheer, she would immediately jump up and cheer with everyone. At this time someone shouted, "And Qianqian is here." This sentence was like a stone thrown into the lake, immediately splashing circles of ripples. After hearing this sentence, many of the audience immediately stood up and ran out of the sports field. The players on the field also heard the movement. This was not an official game, but a training game for the school's football team. Therefore, several of the team members stopped on the spot. After looking around, they did not even bother with the game and directly ran out of the sports field with the crowd. Seeing that the lively sports field suddenly became empty, the little fellow ran to Qinshi and asked doubtfully, "Papa, why did they leave?" Looking at the little fellow's unsatisfied look, Qinshi immediately smiled and pulled her into his arms. Then he fooled her. "They are students, of course they are going to class. Nian, do you still remember what Teacher Wang taught you before? What should you do after hearing the bell?" She had been to kindergarten before and naturally knew the rules of the kindergarten, so she immediately laughed and replied, "I remember. I want to go to the classroom." Smart. You see, your brothers and sisters have all gone to class. Do you want to go to class? Hearing this, the little fellow immediately tilted her head and pondered. After all, there were so many children in the kindergarten. In addition to teaching them singing and drawing, the teachers would also organize them to play games together. In fact, it was quite fun. But if she went to kindergarten, she wouldn't be able to stay by her parents' side all day. Therefore, after serious consideration, the little thing shook its head and said with obvious hesitation, "I don't want to go." When Chunshi saw her reaction, he immediately knew what was going on. Looking at this situation, if he were to guide her a little after returning to Shangjing, this child would probably still be willing to go to kindergarten. Because many students had left, the field had become much quieter. Without any excitement to watch, this little thing obviously couldn't sit still. Therefore, Chunshi picked up the little fellow and held Qin Ruoying's hand as they wandered around the school again. There were 3 campuses in Zhonghai University. They were currently at the headquarters, which was the old campus. However, even though the old campus was located in the city, it covered a large area. It was more than 3,000 mu, which was more than 2 million square meters. Therefore, it would take at least 1 or 2 hours for the couple to explore the entire Zhonghai University. Anyway, it was still early, and they had nothing to do, so they casually strolled around the campus. They didn't take the main road, but chose a small path in the forest. The rain was so light that they didn't even need to use an umbrella, but it was long-lasting. A few drops would fall from time to time, so it still wet the stone path along the way. Walking on such a path, in a trance, the deep and distant mood came back. He still remembered that 10 years ago, they also walked side by side on this path. Even if there were no words along the way, it didn't prevent them from knocking on each other's hearts. Just like the moral scriptures said, the big voice is silent, the elephant is invisible, and great love is speechless. The family of 3 strolled slowly along the path. After passing through the forest path and walking around the lake, they arrived at the teaching building area. The school was supposed to be a quiet place, but now it was very lively. They didn't know what happened, but many students crowded in the open space outside the teaching building, blocking the surrounding roads. This lively scene naturally attracted the little fellow's attention. "Papa, what are they looking at? I want to see it too." Under the little fellow's constant shouting, Chunshi had to lift her up high, and then tried to squeeze in the direction of the crowd. Although most of the vision was blocked by the wall of people, Chunshi listened for a while and understood what was going on here. It turned out that there was a film crew here. These days, filming was not a rare thing. The main reason why there was such a big commotion was mainly because of the female lead of this film. The female lead was called Inai Qianqian, and she was a popular female star recently. Her popularity was already very high, and she graduated from Zhonghai University, so it was a home field for her. Naturally, the junior brothers and sisters came to support her. which was why there was such a big commotion. "Papa, they're shooting a movie! Shooting a movie!" The little fellow also heard the discussion around her. When the 3 words "shooting a movie" drilled into her ears, the little fellow suddenly sat on Chunxi's shoulder as if she had been injected with stimulants. "I want to see a movie. Papa, go over a little. I can't see. I can't see." Although there were many people around, the discussion was not very loud. After all, everyone knew that the sound of the scene was recorded in a movie, so when they spoke, they deliberately lowered their voices. After the little guy made such a ruckus at the top of his voice, it immediately attracted the attention of many people. The students standing in front turned around to look at the little fellow, and then they all moved to the sides, making a path for them in the impenetrable crowd. Respecting the old and loving the young was a traditional Chinese virtue, which was most easily reflected in the hot-blooded college students. "Thank you." Chunxi squeezed through the passageway with the little girl in her arms and thanked the students along the way. At this time, Qin Ruoying whispered a few words to the little fellow. It was not right to shout like this in public. It was very rude, and it showed that she had no family education. The little fellow was very sensible. So after listening to her mother's words, she seemed to understand that her behavior just now was a little rude. So she copied Chunxi and kept thanking the students on both sides. "Thank you, brother. Thank you, sister. I'm sorry." After saying that, the little fellow was a little embarrassed and stuck out her little tongue. That cute little look made a female student next to her couldn't help but praise. "Sister, your daughter is so cute." "Thank you." Qin Ruoying smiled and nodded. After reaching out and pinching the little fellow's little face, she followed Chunxi to the front of the crowd. When they came to the front row, they finally saw the appearance of the big star. She was really beautiful. Probably because they were shooting a youth campus drama, the female lead was dressed as a student and looked very pure. With the help of the makeup artist, she looked about the same age as the surrounding students. She was completely a young girl in her early 20s. However, when Chunxi saw the appearance of the female star, he immediately couldn't help shaking his head and laughing. Chapter 270. Inai Qingyu had changed her name to Inai Qianqian. Last year, due to the broadcast of a phenomenal web drama, she became popular all over the internet. Coupled with the company's support and various resources, she was successfully sent to several of the most popular variety shows. She established a youthful and lovely persona in front of the audience, and attracted a large number of fans. Because of this, Inai Qianqian became one of the most popular young actresses, and successfully entered the ranks of A-list actresses. Times were developing faster and faster, and so was the entertainment industry. Just like what Andy Zai sang in 17: I shamelessly participated in the challenge when I was 17. Even stars have training classes, it's so refreshing in just 1 year. Andy Zai joined the wireless training class in 1981, and started as a film and television actor. Under the guidance of brother Fa, he started as an extra and entered the music industry in 1986. It wasn't until the early 1990s that he finally gained a place in the music industry with the song, If You Were My Legend. After that, in addition to creating a series of iconic characters on the screen, he also released a number of hit singles such as Thank You for Your Love, Wang Qing Shui, and other classic love songs. Finally, he was promoted to the throne of the 4 heavenly kings by the Hong Kong media. At this time, Andy Zai had been in the music industry for more than a decade. Almost all of the stars in that era were versatile artists who could act and sing. Many of them were even radio hosts. But now, from the 18th tier to the A-list, it might only take one movie or TV series. Some of them didn't even know how to act. They only needed to be good-looking and participate in a few variety shows to become popular all over the country. This also created a strange phenomenon. Nowadays, stars become popular quickly, but they also become popular very quickly. A few years ago, the little fresh meat that was in the headlines almost every day was forgotten in just 2 or 3 years. Inai Qianqian knew the cruelty of the entertainment industry. Since she finally became popular, she naturally wanted to seize this opportunity. Therefore, she tried her best to maintain her popularity. Therefore, she suggested to the director that the shooting location be her alma mater. She also wanted to use this opportunity to make another wave of headlines. No matter what, Zhonghai University was still one of the top 10 universities in the country. Ni Qianqian's academic qualifications allowed her to beat the other illiterates in the entertainment industry, earning her the title of Goddess of Academic Qualifications. The reason why Chen-Shi was able to call out Ni Qianqian's real name was because this little girl who appeared to be in her early 20s was actually an old auntie from the same batch as them. For an idol artist who relied on her looks and personality to attract fans, age was obviously a scary thing. After all, Qin Ruoying, who was the same age as her, was already a mother of a 5-year-old child. On the other hand, Ni Qianqian still had to play the role of a pure and lovely girl in front of the public. This kind of situation where his appearance did not match his actual age was really suspicious. Would she show symptoms of schizophrenia? Because of the little girl's protective talisman, the students forcibly made room for the family of 3 in the front row. After hearing Chen-Shi's words, Qin Ruoying immediately looked in the direction that Chen-Shi was pointing at. It's really her, Ni Qianyu. She's a big star now? Ni Qianqian and Qin Ruoying were students of the same major, so they usually saw each other frequently. Although their relationship was not considered close, after so many years after graduation, suddenly meeting an old classmate of hers naturally gave people a sense of closeness. Ni Qianqian had only entered the entertainment industry after graduating from university. She could be considered to be one of those talented people. After acting in a web drama, her acting skills had improved rapidly. Now that she was acting in a movie, no one could find any fault with her. This scene was very simple. It was a scene where the male and female lead reunited in university. After all, it was just a youth school movie, so the requirements for acting skills were not high. As long as the performance was natural, it was fine. Therefore, after 2 takes, the director shouted through the loudspeaker, "Cut! Very good, this scene is done. Young Master Ting, change your clothes and prepare for the next scene. Qianqian, you've finished filming today. Go back and have a good rest. We'll continue tomorrow." "Okay, director." After hearing the director's words, Ni Qianqian smiled politely. Seeing that the crew was busy rearranging the set, someone hiding in the crowd suddenly shouted, "Ni Qianqian, I love you." This sentence instantly ignited the enthusiasm of the surrounding students. Everyone chimed in one after another. "Senior, you're so beautiful. I love you. Senior, give me an autograph. Senior Qianqian, I want to give birth to your children." Looking at the lively scene, if it were not for the staff stopping them, this group of enthusiastic students would have rushed up to Ni Qianqian to ask for an autograph. "Thank you, everyone. Thank you, my cute junior brothers and sisters." Seeing that everyone was so enthusiastic, Ni Qianqian turned around and bowed to the surrounding crowd. When she bowed for the 3rd time, Ni Qianqian finally found a familiar figure in the crowd. Then, Ni Qianqian was stunned. With Chen-Shi's eyesight, he immediately noticed the strange look that flashed across Ni Qianqian's eyes. However, he thought that Ni Qianqian was just surprised to see an old classmate, so he did not take it to heart. Ni Qianqian was indeed an actress. After the surprise flashed across her face, she immediately put on a warm smile and walked toward the direction of the family of 3. The surrounding students thought that she was coming over to give an autograph, so they instantly became excited. "Senior, I have a pen. Give me an autograph. Please give me an autograph. Senior, I love you." Ni Qianqian kept waving at the surrounding students, but she did not have any intention of giving them an autograph. After arriving in front of Qin Ruoying, Ni Qianqian lifted the cordon set by the crew and smiled at Qin Ruoying. "Long time no see." Qin Ruoying did not expect Ni Qianqian to recognize her as an old classmate, so she was stunned for a moment before she replied with a smile, "Long time no see." As the crowd was too excited, after a simple greeting, Ni Qianqian gestured for Chen-Shi's family to follow her in. Seeing this, the couple could not help but look at each other. Ni Qianqian then led them through the cordon and followed her to the temporary resting area set up by the crew. There were originally a few crew members resting in the resting area, But when they saw Ai Qianqian coming over, they very consciously retreated. After inviting Chunxi's family to take a seat, Ai Qianqian then looked at the little girl in Chunxi's arms and asked, "Is this your daughter? How old is she?" "Almost 5 years old." Qin Ruoying replied politely, then turned to the little girl and said, "Nian Nian, greet auntie." Hearing this, the little girl immediately greeted Ai Qianqian sweetly, "Auntie. Good girl." After a few simple pleasantries, the two of them fell silent. They did not seem to know what to talk about with each other. After all, the two of them were not very close when they were in university. They could not even be considered friends. They were probably classmates who would greet each other when they met on the road. The reason why Qin Ruoying felt that Ai Qianqian was very close to her was because they had been classmates for a long time. Chunxi and Qin Ruoying were originally not in the same major, so naturally, he and Ai Qianqian were even more distant. Therefore, Chunxi simply sat beside the little girl and played with her, leaving the space for them to catch up. Ai Qianqian was silent for a while. Then, as if she thought of something, she suddenly smiled and said, "Ying, do you mind if I call you that?" "I don't mind. Do you know? When I first saw you, a very popular online song suddenly popped up in my head." What song?" "School Bell." Then Ai Qianqian softly hummed the song. "They all say she is a flower. Flowers are not as good as her. They all say she is a dream. How many people have pursued her? The heartless years like water, slowly painted in the books. Ask the fleeting clouds, how is our school bell? Who plays the guitar and wants to be the school bell? Who will be the school bell? So love is like a blackboard eraser." Chapter 271. Ai Qianqian simply hummed a few words. Her voice was very pleasant, and it seemed like she had learned to sing before. Therefore, such a seemingly vulgar online song had a different flavor under her interpretation. Looking at Qin Ruoying's puzzled expression, Ai Qianqian suddenly smiled and said, "Ying, 10 years have passed and you're even prettier than before. You're indeed worthy of being the campus belle of our batch." Qin Ruoying smiled and shook her head when she heard that. She turned to look at the little girl in Chunxi's arms and replied, "I can't afford to be called that. You, on the other hand, are now a big star and the juniors outside are all your fans." Ha! Ai Qianqian looked at the crowd outside the resting area, and a faint smile flashed across her face. Ever since she became popular, the feeling of being the center of attention had always lingered around her. From the initial discomfort to the current calmness, Ai Qianqian had a very rich psychological experience. She was now like a goddess standing on the clouds. This gave Ai Qianqian a lot of confidence. For example, when she faced the goddess in front of her who once made her feel ashamed, Ai Qianqian could not help but feel pity for her. With Qin Ruoying's beauty, Ai Qianqian would not be surprised if she became the second sister Milk Tea. However, she still married the poor guy that everyone looked down on, and even gave birth to a daughter for him. Although their family seemed to be very happy now, such an ordinary life was definitely not what Ai Qianqian wanted. What a pity! Ai Qianqian felt pity for Qin Ruoying, because she had been in the entertainment industry for many years, and had a pair of discerning eyes. Just like Tang Wei's character in When Beijing Meets Seattle 2, Ai Qianqian could easily determine the total value of Qin Ruoying's clothes with just a casual glance. Qin Ruoying didn't wear any jewelry or watches. Although the simple gray coat looked like it was custom-made, it still couldn't hide the rough workmanship of the coat itself. A conservative estimate was that she was only worth 500 yuan from head to toe. Looking at Chunxi and the little girl, they were also dressed in cheap clothes. If a man was really capable, he would obviously not mistreat his wife and daughter. Therefore, Ai Qianqian came to a conclusion. The family of 3 in front of her was not very rich, and might even be a little short of money. As the saying went, a woman should be raised well. Although Qin Ruoying still looked glamorous now, what would happen in a few years? Women needed maintenance and maintenance needed money. Perhaps she would only truly understand these principles when she grew old and exhausted the beauty bestowed upon her by the heavens, in order to avoid looking down on others. Ai Qianqian also asked about Chunxi and Qin Ruoying's current work situation during the chat. When she found out that the husband and wife were running a tea house together, her guess was immediately confirmed. This caused Enai Qianqian to feel bored to death. After all, they were not from the same world. No matter how outstanding they were when they were students, once they chose the wrong path after graduation, wouldn't the end result be to become ordinary? Enai Qianqian was a popular actress. Even if she found out about Qin Ruoying's background during the conversation, her face did not show a trace of contempt. After the two chatted for a while, Enai Qianqian apologetically mentioned that she had to rush to a job later. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying immediately nodded to express her understanding. Then, the reunion ended in a happy atmosphere. Before leaving, Enai Qianqian took the initiative to add Qin Ruoying's WeChat and warmly said that they could keep in touch in the future. The reason why she did this was because she felt that Qin Ruoying still had room to recover. People would always grow up. Under her influence, perhaps Qin Ruoying would suddenly come around one day. With Qin Ruoying's beauty, figure, and unique temperament, as long as she nodded, Enai Qianqian could definitely introduce her to an ideal family. Maybe they could even be good sisters in the future? Enai Qianqian smiled as she sent Chunxi's family out of the cordon. After waving goodbye to them, she turned around and walked to the set. From the beginning to the end, she did not put on any airs in front of the family of three. The couple walked out of the crowd under the envious eyes of the fans. After walking for a while, Qin Ruoying suddenly asked thoughtfully, "What do you think of Enai Qianqian?" Hearing this, Chunxi smiled and replied, "He's an adult." "What do you mean? Isn't there a popular saying now? Peppa Pig gets a tattoo and applause for society. Enai Qianqian is a standard society person." "I don't quite understand what you mean." When Chunxi saw Qin Ruoying's confused face, he could not help but reach out and hug her slender waist. He smiled and said, "If you don't understand, then don't think too much. Let's go. We don't belong to the same world." The couple continued to stroll around the campus. It wasn't until the little girl was a little bored and wanted to go home to watch cartoons that they walked back in the direction of the school gate. Just as they were about to walk out of the school gate, a Toyota Alpha, commonly known as a celebrity nanny van, drove past them discreetly. When the assistant sitting in the passenger seat saw Chunxi's family, she could not help but turn around and remind Enai Qianqian, "Qianqian, your old classmates are still there. Should we give them a ride?" Enai Qianqian was sitting in the back with a face mask on. When she heard the assistant's words, she turned her head sideways and glanced out the window. Then she said indifferently, "No need, let's just go." Okay. She had already cast the bait. As for whether the fish would take the bait or not, it was up to the fish. Enai Qianqian was half lying on the seat confidently. She even began to look forward to the moment when Qin Ruoying would chat with her on WeChat. However, when Enai Qianqian was resting with her face mask on, the assistant's voice sounded again. "Sister Qianqian, look, that person seems to be CEO Su from Weisheng Pharmaceutical. Hey, the one next to him should be CEO Ning from China Ocean Corporation, right? Why are they here?" As a celebrity assistant, there were actually a lot of things to learn. For example, she had to at least know some business moguls. What were business moguls to celebrities? They were scripts. They were resources. They were everything. To sum it up in two simple and crude words, that was sugar daddy. As long as the sugar daddy was strong enough, even an internet celebrity could be smashed by a rich businessman. Therefore, how to curry favor with the rich had become a compulsory course for celebrities. Of course, this did not mean that she had to sleep with them. Businessmen were after profits. A movie was worth hundreds of millions of investment. Did she really think that she could become the female lead just by sleeping with the financier? How could it be that simple? Businessmen would definitely not do a losing business. It was not easy to get a rich businessman to invest in her new movie. It was obviously a very effective way to make her presence known in front of a rich businessman. Therefore, Enai Qianqian immediately sat up from the chair. After making sure that she was not mistaken, she pulled off the mask on her face and quickly shouted to her assistant, "Where's my bag? Quick, quick, let me touch up my makeup." The minivan was parked in a parking space not far from the school gate. Then, Enai Qianqian started to touch up her makeup in the car. But just as she was in a hurry, something happened that left her flabbergasted. The two top business moguls in Zhonghai were like concierge at this moment. They quickly ran to Chunxi's family, bowed and asked for instructions, and escorted Chunxi's family to the Bentley Grand limousine. At this moment, Anai Qianqian was completely stunned. An indescribable feeling suddenly surged from her heart, and immediately, her face became rosy like a ripe rose. And this feeling of blushing, she had not experienced this for many years. The assistant saw that Anai Qianqian was still in a daze, so she could not help but remind her. Sister Qianqian, they seem to be leaving. Hearing this, Anai Qianqian suddenly trembled as if she had been electrocuted. Chapter 272. Chunxi and his family did not know what kind of psychological changes Anai Qianqian had gone through in the past 2 hours. At the same time, what Anai Qianqian did not know was that when Chunxi pointed out that she and Qin Ruoying were not from the same world, Qin Ruoying nodded thoughtfully. Then, she took out her phone and deleted Anai Qianqian's WeChat friend list. Therefore, Anai Qianqian might not be able to wait for Qin Ruoying to take the initiative to send her a WeChat message. The reason was simple. Although they were old classmates, after so many years of polishing, their worldview, outlook on life, and values were clearly not on the same line. In other words, they did not have the same values, so of course, they would not be able to pee into the same pot. Qin Ruoying had a cold personality. In her opinion, since she and Anai Qianqian did not have the same topics, there was no need for them to contact each other. Because of this, her total number of WeChat friends was the same as Chunxi's. She only had 3 contacts: Chunxi, Aunt Zhang, and Qin Wanqing. In fact, if it were not for the frequent video calls with Aunt Zhang, Qin Ruoying would not have downloaded WeChat. The family of 3 got into Su Wei's luxury car. Then they slowly left Zhonghai University under the envious gazes of the students. After the car drove for a while, Ning Zhonghua looked down at the time. 4:50 p.m. It was almost time to prepare dinner. Therefore, he rolled down the partition in the car and asked the little girl with a pleasant expression, "Nian Nian, are you hungry? What do you want to eat later? There's all kinds of good food in Zhonghai. Uncle will take you to eat the best food today, okay?" Perhaps it was because they had just discussed the strategy, but Ning Zhonghua now focused all his attention on the little girl. He finally understood what was going on. In this family of 3, Chunxi did not have the final say, and Qin Ruoying did not have the final say. The one who had the final say was the little girl in front of him who was tossing and turning in her seat. After hearing Ning Zhonggua's words, the little thing pouted and began to think. She wasn't hungry yet, but she still wanted to eat something. Therefore, after touching her little belly, the little girl said proudly, "My papa's cooking is the best. I like to eat papa's food. Today, I'll treat your family to a meal outside. How about we go to a restaurant?" "Eat outside? What are we eating? I see that you like it. Nian Nian, what is your favorite dish?" When it came to eating, the little thing immediately became excited. Therefore, she immediately replied excitedly, "I like braised lion's head, and sweet and sour pork ribs, and prawns. Papa's prawns are delicious. Then Uncle will take you to eat the most authentic local dishes in Zhonghai, okay? All right." Chapter 273. As the saying goes, one who is unaccountably solicitous is hiding evil intentions. Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei spent so much effort to come up with so many tricks. Obviously, they didn't just want to make their presence known in front of Chunxi. And this kind of flattery, for these 2 business moguls who were over 100 years old, was really a different experience. After all, with their status, even the mayor of Zhonghai had to give them some face. When money and power were no longer life goals, then health and longevity were obviously their last pursuit. Therefore, Chunxi didn't even need to think to know what the 2 of them wanted from her. Seeing that the little guy was so happy today, Chunxi gave them a chance to speak. The moment Chunxi's voice fell, even with Ning Zhonggua's shrewdness, he still couldn't help but have a flash of joy on his face. Even Ning Zhonggua lost his composure, not to mention Su Wei. Overjoyed, Su Wei's face immediately showed a harmless smile. That smile also made him look like a farmer on the ridge of the fields. Where was his usual decisiveness of a CEO? The two quietly looked at each other. Then Ning Zhonghua coughed twice and put on a slightly awkward expression as he said to Chun Shi, "Mr. Chun, actually it's like this. You know, life is not like before. Alcohol, women, avarice, and anger are the most hurtful. When a person's body is weak, it is easy to get all kinds of diseases. Only when you get sick will you realize the importance of health." Sure enough, it was for the energy pill. Chun Shi leaned on the railing and looked at Ning Zhonghua quietly. Under his gaze, Ning Zhonghua seemed to be under a huge pressure. In just a short while, beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. He was like a primary school student who made a mistake. His voice became smaller and smaller. In the end, Ning Zhonghua couldn't help but lower his head. He didn't dare to look at Chun Shi again. "Ever since the incident last time, the two of us have been following your orders and not revealing any information about you. We told the public that the expert who made the Yama's sorrow had passed away. But what we didn't expect was that the rumor would become more and more ridiculous as it spread. Now, as long as someone has a difficult illness, they will come to us for help. We don't know how many people we have offended because of this." While Ning Zhonghua was explaining his difficulties in a low voice, the little fellow on the second deck suddenly raised her small head and shouted at Chun Shi, who was standing on the third deck, "Papa, there is a sofa here. Come and sit down." As she spoke, she excitedly patted the deck sofa beside her. The sofa was soft, even more comfortable than lying on a bed. Coupled with the afterglow of the setting sun and the gentle caress of the sea breeze, this young fellow had learned to enjoy the beauty of nature. "Okay, Dad will come down to accompany you." Chun Shi turned around and replied to the little fellow. Seeing this, Ning Zhonghua immediately swallowed back his unfinished words, and then stood aside solemnly without saying a word. Chun Shi glanced at him, but didn't say a word. She walked straight to the spiral staircase on the side. Seeing this, Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei couldn't help but have a very complicated expression on their faces. It's over. Both of them knew their limits. Seeing that Chun Shi didn't say anything, they naturally wouldn't ask for trouble on this topic. Then dinner began in a happy atmosphere. The yacht meandered along the Dian River. The little fellow chewed on the ribs and looked at the beautiful scenery brought by the lights on both sides of the river. She couldn't help but murmur, "Papa, it's so beautiful outside." "Do you like it?" "I like it." "Then Uncle will treat you to a big meal and take you to see such beautiful scenery. Shouldn't you thank Uncle properly?" Hearing this, the little fellow immediately wiped the oil stains on her mouth with her hand, and then smiled sweetly at Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei. "Thank you, Uncle Ning. Thank you, Uncle Su. Hihi Nian Nian, if you like, you can come and play with Uncle at any time. Uncle will take you to have a good time in Zhonghai. How about it?" "Okay. Thank you, Uncle. This child is really likable. Mr. Chun is so lucky." After dinner, Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei sent Chun Shi's family back to the Kongju community. As for the elixir, the two of them didn't dare to mention it again. After the little fellow politely said goodbye to the two uncles, the family of three turned around and walked to the Kongju community. When they brought the little girl to the entrance of the neighborhood, the couple stopped in their tracks at the same time. At this moment, the two of them couldn't help but have mixed feelings in their hearts. After all, this was the home that the two of them built together. Although this home was simple, it carried too many things: the sky, the breeze, the air, the temperature, the fragrance at that time, that feeling, the memories that were stagnant like film, you and me at that time. When the breeze blew, those things that couldn't be taken away were all called the past. Under the dim yellow light, the couple's shadows were very long. Perhaps because of the emotions in her heart, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but have tears in her eyes. And just as the couple looked at each other in silence and reminisced about the past, a clear and crisp voice sounded very untimely. "Mama, let's go home. We're going home." As she spoke, the little fellow who spoiled the mood sat in Chun Shi's arms and reached out to Qin Ruoying. She wanted to go into her mother's arms. After all, for this little fellow, her mother seemed to have left for a longer time. Qin Ruoying quietly wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes. and then smiled as she took the little fellow from Chen-Shi's arms. Accompanied by Nian-Nian's somewhat disturbing shouts, they finally returned home. Perhaps it was the same feeling as Chen-Shi felt when he first returned. When Qin Ruoying walked into the room and saw the familiar furnishings in the house, she couldn't help but burst into tears like a broken dam. 5 years. It was indeed too long. After entering the room, the little fellow ran straight to the TV. After skillfully turning on the TV, she looked back at the door. When she saw her father and mother hugging each other excitedly, she immediately tilted her head and asked in confusion, "Papa, what's wrong with Mama?" Hearing this, Qin Ruoying gently pushed Chen-Shi away and wiped the tears on her face. Seeing that she was still adjusting her mood, Chen-Shi turned back and said to the little fellow, "Sand got into Mama's eyes. Papa is blowing it for her." "Oh." The little fellow nodded as if she understood, and then shouted to Qin Ruoying, "Mama, watch cartoons with me." As she spoke, she patted the sofa beside her and motioned Qin Ruoying to come and sit down. "Okay, we'll watch with you." Qin Ruoying wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes, and then pulled Chen-Shi to the little fellow's side. The family of 3 huddled together on the old sofa. Chapter 274. The next morning, after eating the breakfast made with love by Chen-Shi, the little fellow lay on the sofa with a bulging belly and obediently recited a Tang poem. "Sleeping in spring, I hear birds singing everywhere. Wind and rain come at night, I wonder how many flowers fall." The little fellow recited very fluently, so after she finished reciting, she raised her little head and waited for her mother's praise with joy. However, what she didn't expect was that when Qin Ruoying came to her side, she didn't praise her, but patted her lightly. This made the little fellow pout unhappily. Looking at her aggrieved little face, Qin Ruoying smiled and pinched her little face, then patiently explained, "Nian-Nian, when you recite, you have to sit properly. Do you remember what mother taught you? You have to sit properly, and you have to stand properly. Have you forgotten it so quickly?" Hearing this, the little fellow's head immediately drooped down. After shaking her head, she seemed to realize that she was wrong, so she burrowed into Qin Ruoying's arms and said very coquettishly, "I didn't forget." "It's good that you didn't forget. Sit up. Mother will recite the ancient poem with you, okay?" "Okay." After all, the child was still young, so she had to develop good living habits. Therefore, after teaching her to recite Quiet Night Thoughts and climbing Yellow Crane Tower, Qin Ruoying allowed the little fellow to watch cartoons. While the little fellow was watching cartoons, the husband and wife softly talked about the recent schedule. Gu Lao had already brought the twins back to Shangjing. Previously, he called Chen-Shi to ask when they would open the door. Although the house in the Kongju district was simple, it was built by the 2 of them, so Qin Ruoying wanted to stay here for a few more days, which could also be considered as a kind of remembrance. But just as Qin Ruoying was recalling the little sweetness in the past, she seemed to have thought of something and suddenly asked, "Oh right, do you have Lin Xian's contact information?" "Yes, I'll find it for you." Chen-Shi took out his phone. After dialing Lin Xian's number, he handed the phone to Qin Ruoying. The call was quickly connected. Lin Xian's voice sounded from the other end of the phone. "Hello, Chen-Shi." Her voice was very calm, as if there was no emotion at all. When Qin Ruoying heard her voice, she did not speak immediately. Instead, she playfully pressed the speaker button and signaled for Chen-Shi to answer. Chen-Shi glanced at Qin Ruoying, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Then he said to the phone, "Ahem. Yes, it's me. Ying is beside you, right? Get her to answer the phone." "Huh." The couple looked at each other in surprise. Qin Ruoying asked in confusion, "Xian, how did you know I was there?" Hearing this, Lin Xian on the other end of the phone immediately laughed out loud. Her laughter was very clear, like the tinkling of a bell. And it even won first place in the professional portrait category. It seems to be on tour around the world now. Pfft. After hearing what Lin Xian said, Chen-Shi almost spat out a mouthful of blood. Wasn't this too ridiculous? At that time he did not want to dampen the girl's passion for photography, and Qin Ruoying did not mind, so he nodded and agreed. However, what Chunxi did not expect was that this girl was so amazing. She actually used this photo to win a world-class award? It was no wonder that Lin Xian said that the two of them were now internet celebrities. Was this not considered internet celebrities? They were already F***king famous overseas. This sudden situation made the couple not know whether to laugh or cry. Lin Xian probably guessed how the two of them were feeling, so after laughing for a while, she quickly hung up the phone. After hearing the beeping sound from the phone, Qin Ruoying handed the phone to Chunxi and asked Chunxi to look for information about the photo online. At the same time, Lin Xian sat in front of her desk and looked at the photo on the table with a blank expression. On her face, there was no trace of the happiness she had shown on the phone just now. There were two photo frames on the table. One was a full-body photo of her. The other, wasn't it the photo of Chunxi and Qin Ruoying? I also want to let the pirated students see this, so I can only put it in the main text. I hope you can forgive me. What I want to say is, the theme of this book is about stay-at-home dads, but it is also because of stay-at-home dads that my writing style is limited. Because of the existence of Nian. Every day that passes in the book, Nian will grow up another day. Therefore, this book can't be like the common urban novels. In the blink of an eye, a month has passed. In the blink of an eye, a year has passed. Immortal cultivation and stay-at-home dads, in essence, are conflicting. Therefore, the plot of this book is usually not continuous. After all, there is always a cause, a process, and a result when something happens. And this process needs time to ferment. For example, this photo may be buried for half a year before it appears again. I hope everyone can understand what I mean, sincerely. Also, I update slowly, but I will never stop. This is for you to hear, and also for me to hear. It is also a kind of self-warning. Regarding the issue of updating, I also want to try my best to return to a stable 2 updates a day, but I should have entered a bottleneck. I am very tired of writing, and also very annoyed. I feel that every word I write is torture. I didn't ask for monthly votes on the day I put it up, because I expected this to happen, so I didn't dare to make careless promises. In short, I have already decided. I will start from 3 updates a day and slowly adjust back. Finally, thank you again for your continuous support. Chapter 275. World Photography Competition Exhibition. This award was very prestigious and professional, but it was too professional. Therefore, when the winners of the competition were announced, it didn't cause much of a stir on the internet. After all, compared to breaking news like a celebrity's infidelity, professional news was indeed too niche. Lin Xian said that Chunxi and his wife were now online because of this photo titled Lovers, which really amazed many photography enthusiasts and insiders. Photography was the same as painting. It was to show static beauty to the world. But the difference between photography and painting was that painting could be created at will, while photography honestly recorded everything that happened at the time. The scenes shown in the photos were also scenes that had once appeared in this world. The selection method of the photography award was nothing more than the evaluation of the theme, scene, composition, exposure, tone, clarity, and several other aspects. The reason why this photo won first place in the professional portrait category was entirely because the couple in the photo was too dazzling. Just like a war photographer taking photos of refugees on the battlefield, the subject matter itself was a bonus. It was a kind of luck to be able to meet such an outstanding model in the vast sea of people. But the art of photography sometimes really did require a certain amount of luck. Weren't many world-famous classic photos captured by photographers by chance? Therefore, although the photographer named Sun Yuan's skills were mediocre, she still managed to stand out from the rest of the entries and become a celebrity in the circle. And now, wasn't this award-winning photo on display at London's Somerset Palace? After Chunxi showed the news he found on the internet to Qin Ruoying, the couple didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It seemed that they had to pay more attention to protecting their portrait rights in the future. They didn't want to be online, so this kind of feeling of putting their photos on the internet for the world to see, it was a bit strange. However, since they had already given it, It was too late for regrets. Therefore, the couple could only adjust their mood and completely forget about this matter. Later, the couple accompanied the little girl to watch cartoons for a while, and then went out to find Lin Xian to catch up. The lunch location was chosen by Lin Xian. It was a Western restaurant with a good reputation, and was very friendly. The restaurant's location was good. It was on the edge of the Dianjiang River. Sitting in the outdoor seats outside the restaurant, one could overlook the entire Dianjiang River. Perhaps it was because it was close to the business district, so when Chen-Shi's family arrived at the restaurant, there were already many business people in formal attire sitting there. And regarding this problem, the couple had already discussed the countermeasures, so Qin Ruoying immediately made up a lie that was born out of the truth. The general meaning was, her family didn't agree to her marriage with Chen-Shi, so she could only abandon her husband and daughter and return to her hometown. These years she didn't have a very good life. It wasn't until Chen-Shi came to her hometown to find her that her family was moved by Chen-Shi's sincerity, and finally approved this marriage. The story wasn't very complicated, but Lin Xian couldn't help but frown slightly after hearing it. Ying, what era is this? Your family still pays attention to the words of the parents and the matchmaker? Why do I feel that with your personality? You shouldn't be so obedient to your family. Are you lying to me? Hearing this, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but smile and ask, "Oh? Then tell me, why would I lie to you? I can't say it, but I keep feeling a little weird. I don't really believe what you said just now. What I said is the truth. If you don't believe me, then I can't help it." Okay. Seeing that Lin Xian nodded suspiciously, Qin Ruoying decisively changed the topic and took the initiative to ask, Xian, what about you? How have you been these few years? Are you married? Do you have children? Hearing this, Lin Xian's expression couldn't help but stiffen, but quickly returned to normal. After forcing a smile, she replied in a seemingly relaxed tone, "Not yet, but I can tell you a piece of good news." What good news? Chapter 276. Engagement? After Lin Xian's voice fell, even Chen-Shi, who was next to her, could not help but turn his head to look at her. It had only been about half a year since the last time they parted at the dock. Who would have thought that Lin Xian was going to get engaged? Who is it? Do I know him? Qin Ruoying threw out a series of questions, but Lin Xian smiled and shook her head after listening. She responded, "You don't know him." At this time, Chen-Shi could not help but interrupt and ask, "Is it Li Xiuwen?" No matter what, Li Xiuwen had pursued Lin Xian for a long time. In addition, Wang Lu had been playing matchmaker and constantly putting good words for him in front of Lin Xian. So if this lucky guy was Li Xiuwen, Chen-Shi would not be surprised at all. However, what Chen-Shi did not expect was, when he mentioned Li Xiuwen's name, Lin Xian still shook her head and replied calmly, "You don't know him either." "Oh, okay." Chen-Shi nodded, then sat on the side and didn't say anything. In fact, after hearing the news that Lin Xian was going to get engaged, Chen-Shi was also happy for Lin Xian from the bottom of his heart. After all, Lin Xian was not young anymore. It was hard enough for her to work alone in Zhonghai for so many years. If she could find someone to rely on, it would be a good thing for her. As for Lin Xian's little thoughts, it was obviously impossible for Chen-Shi not to know. It was just that this kind of thing felt a little awkward just thinking about it, so he could only pretend to be confused. Qin Ruoying did not know the little secret in Lin Xian's heart, so she continued to ask curiously, "You're going to get engaged? How long have you been together?" "It's been almost 4 months." "What? Only 4 months?" Qin Ruoying was truly shocked by Lin Xian's words. Based on her understanding of Lin Xian should be very cautious when it came to relationships, so she really couldn't imagine how outstanding that man was to be able to get Lin Xian to the point where they were talking about marriage in just a few months. Xian, marriage is not child's play. You've only known each other for a few months, and you're already engaged. What's the difference between this and a flash marriage? Wasn't the most common ending of a flash marriage a flash divorce? Especially for women, if they were so careless about marriage, they would be completely irresponsible for their own future. Qin Ruoying wanted to persuade Lin Xian to reconsider. However, Lin Xian seemed to have thought of everything. She smiled and gestured for her not to worry. Then she said, "Ying, don't worry. I'm not a little girl anymore. Do you think I'll be blinded by love? When I said that I was about to get engaged, there was actually a prerequisite." "What prerequisite?" "He has to pass my strict test." Lin Xian couldn't help but blink playfully. Seeing that Qin Ruoying was still confused, she smiled and explained, "We're classmates." "Your daughter is already so old, but I'm still single. How can I not be anxious? How can my family not be anxious? Even if you're anxious, you can't be so careless." Qin Ruoying rolled her eyes at Lin Xian in exasperation. Seeing this, Lin Xian held onto her hand and patiently explained, "Ying, listen to me. Actually, what I mean is that I'm not young anymore. Since I agreed to date someone, it's obvious that I'm aiming for marriage. Grandpa Mao once said that those who don't date for the purpose of marriage are all hooligans. So, I have to carefully examine him. If he can successfully pass my examination, then why can't I marry him?" Qin Ruoying was speechless. After hesitating for a long time, she asked with a puzzled expression, "Xian, do you love him?" "Love." Hearing this, Lin Xian couldn't help but chuckle. "Ying, you might not know. How difficult is it to meet someone you like in this world who also likes you? Actually, a lot of people can only choose one of two. You can either choose the one you like or the one who likes you. I think I'm still very rational, so I choose the latter." Saying this, Lin Xian couldn't help but glance at Chen Shi. She seemed to be envious of the relationship between the couple. Seeing that Lin Xian had already said this, Qin Ruoying naturally couldn't say anything else. Therefore, after hesitating for a while, she could only sincerely wish her well. "Okay, although it's still a little rushed, I believe in your taste, so I wish you happiness in advance. All the best, Xian." "Thank you." Perhaps because this topic was a little heavy, the two quickly changed the topic, and then chatted about everything. Qin Ruoying hadn't talked so much in a long time. After all, she didn't have many friends, and Lin Xian was one of the few that she had left. Therefore, after lunch, Chen Xi's family didn't rush to leave. Instead, they continued to accompany Lin Xian for afternoon tea. In the end, because Lin Xian received a call from her leader, saying that there was an urgent matter that required her to return to the company, Lin Xian could only reluctantly say goodbye to Chen Xi's family. "Sister, goodbye." Lin Xian had just treated the little guy to a lot of desserts, which made the little guy very happy. Therefore, even though Chen Xi had already walked a distance away with her in his arms, the little guy still reluctantly turned back and waved at Lin Xian. "Nian, goodbye. Sister will treat you to good food next time. Come moi. Goodbye, sister." Hearing this, the little guy covered her mouth with both hands, gave Lin Xian a flying kiss, and then obediently returned to Chen Xi's arms. Lin Xian stood by the street. Until Chen Xi's family got into the car and left, she didn't leave. Just like that afternoon last year. It was a beautiful September day, and the pier was quiet. She stood under the palm tree, just like today, watching the car gradually disappear into the distance. Lin Xian was slightly absent-minded. But at this moment, a feminine man's voice suddenly sounded from behind her. Xian, I've been waiting by the side for so long, but you didn't even give me a chance to go on stage? Let me tell you, I'm angry." Lin Xian turned back to look, only to see a gay-looking man in tight pants, walking quickly towards her with a resentful expression. Seeing this, Lin Xian complained helplessly. "Didn't I tell you to wear a suit? Look at you. How can I introduce you to my friend?" Xian, I've said it many times. I don't like, wear, or pretend. What's wrong with me wearing this? Why can't you introduce me to your friend?" Hearing this, Lin Xian could only sigh, and turn to apologize to him. "All right, it's my fault. I shouldn't have asked you to come. I apologize to you. Don't be angry, okay?" I'm not happy. I'm a little angry." All right, I'll treat you to coffee. Don't be angry." Saying this, Lin Xian went up to the man's arm and pulled him to a nearby coffee shop. As they walked, Lin Xian tilted her head to look at the sea not far away. The afternoon sun shone on the surface of the sea. As if the sea was coated with a layer of gold powder, the sparkling waves were almost blinding. In a daze, Lin Xian's thoughts drifted further and further away. Actually, she didn't know what she was thinking about. She asked herself, she wasn't a chaste woman, but why couldn't her heart hold anyone else? Why? What was the reason? Lin Xian really wanted to know the answer. But Chapter 277. After a short reunion with Lin Xian, Qin Ruoying's mood became very happy. Although they hadn't seen each other for many years, after this afternoon's conversation, she was finally sure that there wasn't much of a gap between her and Lin Xian. They were still friends who could talk to each other. This was undoubtedly good news for Qin Ruoying. After all, human beings were social animals. Even if Qin Ruoying's temperament was outstanding, she still needed a few close friends to accompany her. The family of three was in a good mood. Therefore, since getting on the car, the little fellow had been sitting on her knees by the window in the back row, stretching out her head to look at the scenery outside the window. When she saw a gift shop on the street, she couldn't take her eyes off it. Because in the gift shop's cabinet facing the street, there was actually a huge teddy bear. The little fellow liked teddy bears very much, but she had never had a teddy bear of her own. So she immediately put her little hand on the window, pointed at the teddy bear in the distance and said, "Papa, I want that." The little fellow pulled Chunxi's arm, indicating that Chunxi should look in the direction she pointed. How sharp were Chunxi's eyes! With just a casual glance from the corner of his eyes, he already understood what the little fellow wanted. But when Chunxi saw what the little fellow wanted, he didn't promise to buy it for her. Instead, he pretended to be puzzled, as if he didn't see what the little fellow was pointing at. After the little girl anxiously shouted a few words, Chunxi put on an act and moved her head closer to the little girl. Then, she looked in the direction the little girl was pointing at. "Nian, what do you want? Why didn't Papa see it?" That. Over there. Papa, look. Bear. Big bear. I want that. Big bear." In a moment of excitement, the little fellow couldn't even speak clearly. "Where? Come, let me see again." Chunxi continued to pretend that he did not see anything. There was only one reason why he was acting like a fool, and that was, he didn't want to buy the teddy bear for the little girl at all. Of course, the reason why Chunxi didn't want to buy a teddy bear for the little guy was obviously not because of money, but because he was now thinking from the perspective of a parent. After all, the child was still young and had no sense of propriety. If he blindly obeyed the child, he would unknowingly hurt the child. Of course, this kind of damage was hidden. The so-called obedience was actually a disguised form of doting. This was also a taboo question for Chunxi. That was why he pretended to be crazy in order to fool them. The roads in the city were very crowded, so the taxi moved very slowly. However, no matter how slow the car was, when the green light came on, the taxi would still slowly move forward with the traffic. It was probably because of the existence of high-level immortal cultivators on Earth that the Siakan Glacier had such a mysterious palace that could affect the flow of time. Chunxi had already tasted the benefits of the Great Hall. Now that he suddenly realized that there might also be something of the same level as the Great Hall in Zhonghai, Chunxi couldn't help but feel a little moved. The reason why he hadn't taken the initiative to search for them before was mainly because his soul had yet to recover from its injuries at that time. Without his divine sense, he couldn't just wander around this huge city by relying on his eyes alone. Could he? Today, coincidentally, the spirit Chi tide had appeared again. Perhaps he could take this opportunity to find the thing that had sent him to heavenly spiral from the surging spirit chi of heaven and earth. Chun-Shi seriously pondered for a while in the sky. Then, as if he had made a decision, he directly flew towards the seaside. The reason why he wanted to go to the seaside was because the spirit chi on the seaside was much denser than in the city. It was obviously somewhat abnormal. Chun-Shi quickly arrived at the seaside. However, before he had time to see the situation on the sea clearly, the sound of waves rumbled into his ears one after another. At this moment, the sky was already dark. Coupled with the dark clouds and torrential rain, there was not a single bit of light on the sea. Seeing this, Chun-Shi immediately lit up a ball of light and threw it out. Only then did he finally see the situation on the sea clearly. He saw that the waves, which were more than 10 meters tall, were raised high like a wall of water. Then they heavily slammed onto the shore. The waves came one after another, and the sound of waves crashing onto the shore came one after another. That majestic scene could be described as rapid waves rise to the sky, raging waves roll to the ground. The majestic sound was like thunder, and the surging waves were like rolling snow. Fortunately, the torrential rain had driven away the tourists by the seaside. Otherwise, with the waves, which were more than 10 meters tall, coming wave after wave, who knew how many people would die on the spot? Looking at the situation, it seemed like there was a tsunami. However, from a scientific point of view, it was basically impossible for a tsunami to occur in Zhonghai. If there was a tsunami in Zhonghai, then the island country and the Gulf Coast in front of it would have become an underwater world by now. However, there was even an earthquake in Zhonghai today. What was so strange about a tsunami? Chun-Shi didn't stay at the seaside for too long. After briefly checking the situation along the coast, he directly flew towards the depths of the sea. The spirit chi of heaven and earth was getting denser and denser. Could it be, this time the heaven and earth phenomenon really appeared on the sea? Chapter 282. A person. Just like an airdrop, he was directly dropped from the sky by a transport plane. With the help of a flash of lightning, Chun-Shi could clearly see that the person was only wearing a black combat suit. He didn't wear a parachute or a flight suit. After being dropped by the transport plane, the person spread out his hands and did a free fall in the sky. The height of the cumulonimbus cloud was generally between 600 and 2,000 meters. Tonight's thunderclouds gave people a strong sense of oppression, so it could be speculated that the height of the clouds tonight should be about 1,000 meters. 1,000 meters was actually not that high. It would take less than 15 seconds for an object to fall from a height of 1,000 meters. It was a short time, but the falling speed was very fast. When an object fell from a high altitude, due to the acceleration of gravity, the falling speed would become faster and faster. In contrast, the object would be subjected to greater and greater air resistance. When the air resistance reached a certain level, the air resistance would balance with gravity, causing the object to begin to move at a uniform speed. This speed was also called the ultimate speed or the finishing speed. Assuming that this person weighed 60 kilograms, then through the formula V equals, this person's ultimate speed would be 617 kilometers per hour. Falling into the sea at such a speed was no different from falling on a steel plate. With a smack sound, the person would probably be like a cake falling to the ground, instantly turning into a pool of paste. Of course, the above was only a hypothesis from a scientific point of view. Obviously, this outsider in front of him could not be judged by common sense. Sure enough, when the person fell into the sea, after the huge impact was offset by the seawater, he immediately got out of the sea as if nothing had happened. Then he stepped on the stormy waves and went straight in the direction of Chun-Shi. He was indeed running. In ancient times, there was a dharma crossing the river with a reed, but this person did not even use a reed. He just stepped on the waves and ran directly. This directly showed that he had broken through the limits of the human body and stood at the peak of martial arts. And this was the so-called celestial. Chun-Shi floated in the air more than 10 meters above the sea, and quietly watched the person running towards him. It was a man who looked about 30 years old. Although he was wearing a combat suit, he did not have any badge to prove his identity. This was not Wuxia's territory, but a public area in the world. According to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, any country had the right to interrogate and search stateless people and ships on the high seas. Therefore, this kind of behavior that did not even reveal his identity was actually very eye-catching. However, looking at his face, this man should be Wuxia's person. The man ran wildly on the waves and soon came not far below Chun-Shi. With the light ball around Chun-Shi, the man saw Chun-Shi's appearance. Immediately after that, he could not help but show a smile on his face and shouted excitedly, "Mr. Chun, I didn't expect it's you." His voice was so loud that even the sound of the stormy waves was drowned out. But what made him feel strange was that Chun-Shi did not immediately respond after hearing his words. Instead, he stretched out his hand and pointed to the sea in the distance. Seeing this, the man immediately turned his head and looked in the direction Chun-Shi pointed with some doubts. Perhaps because the sky was too dark and his vision was limited, the man looked for a while and did not find anything strange. Just when he was a little puzzled, a few strong lights suddenly appeared on the horizon in the distance. It was the light beam emitted by the military hernia searchlight. The rated power of 15 million watts also made the range of this searchlight reach up to 2,000 meters. It was also a necessary device for ships cruising at sea. As the searchlight's light became brighter and brighter, the man finally saw the appearance of the ship. It was a destroyer with the flag of the United States. Looking at the aggressive posture, it should be the American Army stationed in Okinawa. The rain poured down, and the thunder rumbled in the sky. The waterspout, like a pillar supporting the sky, seemed to have taken root and did not move from beginning to end. After the destroyer shone its searchlight on the waterspout from a distance, it immediately anchored 2 kilometers away. It seemed that it did not dare to get closer. However, although the destroyer did not dare to get closer, it still released a patrol boat. Afterward, the boat rushed straight in the direction of the waterspout with an unstoppable momentum. The sea today was not calm. There were whirlpools and waterspouts, and the waves were at least 3 or 4 meters high. But for some reason, even if the boat was about to be lifted up by the waves, it was able to fall back to the water safely in the end, and then continue to move forward. The waterspout rotated at high speed, like a giant dragon, constantly sucking the sea water from the sea to the sky. In the face of such a huge suction force, not to mention the boat, even the destroyer would be sent to the sky in an instant after approaching. It was unknown who the helmsman of this boat was, but the control of the boat and the judgment of the distance were extremely accurate. Therefore, under the delicate control of the helmsman, the moment the boat was about to enter the edge of the waterspout, it suddenly turned the bow, and then began to circle around the waterspout in a very extreme way. This was already the last safe distance. If the boat was a little closer to the waterspout, it was possible that it would be directly sucked into the turbulence of the waterspout, and then sent to the sky. The boat maintained the last safe distance, and then began to circle around the waterspout. Perhaps it was because the light ball around Chun-Shi was too eye-catching. The people on the boat immediately noticed him. Then, a deep voice came from the small boat. "Ha ha ha ha. I didn't expect Mr. Chin to be here, what a coincidence." Inyang Liao's deputy Inyang assistant, Ijiro Saito, greets you, sir. It was the original recipe, and the familiar smell. Ever since the last time he drove away Shintaro Abe, Chun-Shi had not encountered anyone from Inyang Liao. He did not expect to see them again today in the vast Pacific Ocean. And listening to his self-introduction, this Ijiro Saito, who had not yet appeared in front of him, seemed to be a level higher than Shintaro Abe. Chun-Shi floated in the air, quietly watching the various forces come one after another. After looking down at the small boat that was quickly approaching him, he looked up at the destroyer in the distance with the U.S. military flag flying over it. Even the United States was here. Looking at the star-spangled flag hanging high on the mast of the destroyer, Chun-Shi suddenly had a seemingly irrelevant question in his mind. Since Wuxia had martial artists, Inyang masters in Japan, Brahmins in India, and even tame headmasters in Southeast Asia. Chapter 283. After hearing Ijiro's greeting, Chunshi didn't respond to him. After all, as a Wuxia man, he would always feel some hostility towards a strange Japanese. In contrast, the Wuxia man in front of him was obviously easier to get Chunshi's approval. Therefore, after looking around, Chunshi focused his attention on the Wuxia man in front of him. Then he sat cross-legged in the air, lowered his head and said to him, "Look, they even brought a warship here, but you're all alone. Don't you think it's a bit too shabby?" Hearing this, the man shook his head and smiled bitterly. His name was Qin Shui, one of the main people in charge of the Wu Lian branch in Zhonghai, in charge of intelligence. Qin Shui had just stepped into the diviner stage, so his realm was not very stable, so his rating in the Wu Lian was only S-. The reason why he came here alone was because this was not a mission issued by the Wu Lian, but his own personal action. Tonight, there were all kinds of almost impossible natural disasters in Zhonghai, so the Wu Lian branch of Zhonghai naturally had to be dispatched to prevent any uncontrollable accidents. Qin Shui originally had a mission, but as the only diviner in the Zhonghai branch, he was keenly aware of a huge amount of energy at sea, so he mobilized a transport plane to send him here to check the situation. But what Qin Shui didn't expect was that when he arrived at the destination, he saw a person here. When Chunshi's family traveled, they never deliberately hid their identity, so Qin Shui always knew that Chunshi was in Zhonghai. Therefore, when he first saw the figure, Qin Shui subconsciously thought that this person should be Chunshi, so he changed his original plan and directly jumped out of the plane. The result was as he expected. The person in front of him was indeed Chunshi. Everyone in the Wu Lian branch knew about the new EX-level existence. Qin Shui made a simple self-introduction, after which Chunshi nodded slightly and then asked, "Can you fly?" Chunshi was about 10 meters above the sea, about 3 or 4 stories high, so Qin Shui could only slightly raise his head when talking to him. After hearing Chunshi's words, Qin Shui was stunned for a moment. Then he replied with a troubled expression, "Yes, but not for too long." As far as Qin Shui knew, if it wasn't necessary, he would never fly. After all, for a martial artist, this kind of meaningless consumption was actually the same as an athlete who had to play a game the next day. "Oh, okay." After hearing Qin Shui's words, Chunshi gently waved his hand. Immediately after, a gentle force surrounded Qin Shui. Qin Shui's body suddenly. Because he knew that Chunshi wouldn't attack him for no reason, he didn't resist too fiercely. So he just stared blankly as Chunshi lifted him into the air. This action, of course, this action. This. They didn't seem to hate the United States who dropped the atomic bomb. Instead, they felt that the United States was the savior of Japan. Many fanatics even praised the United States with gratitude. Therefore, Ijiro Saito was very humble in front of the people of the United States. But what Ijiro Saito didn't expect was that his humility lowered his evaluation in the hearts of the people of the United States, and even affected the credibility of Inyang Liao's strength evaluation. As time went by, the waterspout did not become smaller, but thicker and thicker. About half an hour later, the energy contained in the waterspout seemed to have reached its limit. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning struck the waterspout. The waterspout immediately became like an electrified light tube, and light blue snake-shaped electric arcs flashed wildly in it. A huge amount of energy filled it, and the waterspout suddenly expanded more than 10 meters outward at a speed visible to the naked eye. It looked like it was about to explode. Qin Shui opened his eyes and looked at the scene in front of him. Before he could recover, he was pulled back by Chunshi and instantly retreated hundreds of meters away. At this time, the waterspout also began to shake violently. Qin Shui had never seen such a scene, so he couldn't help but ask, "What's going on?" However, before Chunshi could answer his question, the waterspout in front of him suddenly changed again. The originally thick waterspout suddenly separated from the sky and became two in an instant. The two waterspouts rotated and intersected, spiraling straight into the sky, and their shape looked somewhat similar to a fried dough twist. Chunshi frowned slightly. because he suddenly found that all the surrounding spiritual energy was madly rushing towards the center of the two waterspouts. And with the continuous influx of spiritual energy, a bright light suddenly appeared in a position in the middle of the two waterspouts. The light was white, and at first it was only the size of a star, but after a few breaths, the light suddenly burst into an extremely dazzling light. Like the rising sun, it instantly dispelled all the haze between heaven and earth. Such a dazzling light suddenly made Qin Shui couldn't help but close his eyes and slightly tilt his head, not daring to look at it again. But Chunxi didn't seem to be affected at all. She raised her head slightly and calmly looked at the source of the light. Finally, as for the so-called immortal realm, it was probably a cultivation holy land similar to the heavenly jade domain. Because the spiritual energy on earth was too sparse, the only way to maintain the connection between the two realms was to sacrifice Xian Nu's soul. As for that immortal general who had been killed, Chunxi thought that he was a helper that those old B** stars had found from somewhere. Come to think of it, divine generals, weren't they the immortal cultivators who left Earth? Otherwise, with the current cultivation conditions on Earth, the celestial being was already the limit. How could a divine general comparable to Yuan Ying be born? In the blink of an eye, Chunxi sorted out the conjectures in his mind. Because he left Earth, when he returned, he never thought that his home planet was actually a cultivation holy land similar to the heavenly jade domain. At this moment, Chunxi's heart was filled with mixed feelings, and an indescribable feeling suddenly gushed out. One had to know that his current state of mind was completely different from when he first returned, because he had Nian Nian, and at the same time, he had found Ying Ying. They were a happy family. Chunxi had always been someone who cared about his wife and children. As long as the people he cared about were by his side, everything else did not matter. With the cultivation conditions on Earth, he might not be able to take another step toward the soul formation stage in this lifetime. However, Chunxi did not feel regret. Instead, he was optimistic that as long as Ying Ying could cultivate to Yuan Ying, he would be very satisfied. Chunxi even thought that if Ying Ying really could not cultivate to Yuan Ying, he could reluctantly accept the golden core stage. After all, 500 years was not a long time. A family could live happily together for 500 years. What kind of concept was that? Furthermore, even if he really could not accept the terrible ending of Ying Ying leaving first and dying alone, he could at least try to bring Ying Ying and Nian Nian back to the heavenly jade domain and find a way to prolong their lives, right? The future was still early, and it was more important to live well in the present. Therefore, before Nian Nian became an adult, Chunxi would not consider what the future would be like. However, what Chunxi did not expect was that reality was completely different from what he had imagined. Originally, he just wanted to retire and take care of his children on Earth, but he did not expect Earth to be a cultivation holy land comparable to the heavenly jade domain. At least, it used to be. This made Chunxi feel that it was very unreal. Could it be, his peaceful and happy life was going to be broken? And the reason why Chunxi had such a feeling was that he knew how cruel the world of immortal cultivators was. Immortal cultivators were supposed to compete with the heavens and with people. Although there would always be people who naively thought that immortal cultivators could actually join hands and advance together, side by side. However, they neglected the most important problem, and that was, cultivation resources were limited. Although spirit chi could be continuously regenerated, and heavenly treasures could be regenerated indefinitely, the problem was, the lifespan of immortal cultivators was also limited. How to obtain more cultivation resources within their limited lifespan, to continuously improve their realm was the problem that every immortal cultivator had to face. Natural selection, survival of the fittest. If one could not obtain more resources to improve themselves, then they were destined to be eliminated. What was the result of being eliminated? There was only one result, and that was death. This was the real world of immortal cultivators. Compared to the other divine lords in the heavenly jade domain, Chunxi's temperament was indeed much gentler, but he was not a person who liked to avoid problems. Since the problem had already appeared, Then there was only one question left in his heart. Divine General. What level was he in the heavenly gate? The grudge had already been formed. If the other party did not pursue the matter, then Chunshi could also pretend that this matter did not happen. But if the other party wanted to pursue the matter, thinking of this, Chunshi could not help but ignite a burning desire to fight in his heart. In the past he did not care about his life, and even if it was a narrow escape, he would still cross the void. But today was different from the past. As a man, every time he swung his sword, it was no longer for himself, but for his wife and children behind him. If he were to fall as well, what would happen to Yingying and Yinyan? Chunshi's mind was full of thoughts. At this time, the black figure finally walked out of the strong light. But what made Chunshi a little surprised was Chapter 285. Two dragons playing with a pearl. The heavens opened a gate. Chunshi originally wanted to pick up some scraps from this heavenly vision. If he could find another strange existence like the Temple of Time, it would be a very happy thing for him. But it was a pity. He didn't find anything good. Instead, he witnessed the entire process of the Gate of Heaven. With the opening of the Gate of Heaven, three figures also walked out of the strong light one after another. Walking in front was a man wearing a blue brocade robe and a belt around his waist. He was about 30 years old. After walking out of the strong light, the man in blue took a few steps in the air, then slightly turned his body to look at the strong light, as if waiting for his companions. Then, another man walked out of the strong light. That person was wearing a white straight crane cloak. Coupled with the otherworldly temperament on his body, it could be said that he was a stranger like jade, unparalleled in the world. The man in white's temperament was so outstanding, but the third figure following behind him was not inferior in the slightest. Moreover, it was a woman. The woman was very thin, with prominent cheekbones. She was wearing a water blue fairy dress and had a cinnabar between her eyebrows. She looked a bit like Mansion in The Promise. If one had to use a word to describe her, it could only be Kufu. This kind of face was indeed very unlikable, but if coupled with the cold and otherworldly temperament on her body, it brought a different kind of beauty. Two men and one woman. They were all dressed very strangely. At least in the eyes of modern people in the 21st century, they were simply like ancient characters who walked out of an ink painting. The three seemed to be led by the woman who appeared last. After the woman appeared, she arrogantly scanned the surroundings. When she saw Chunshi dragging Qin Shui and flying in the air more than 10 meters above the sea, the corners of her mouth couldn't help but raise a slightly contemptuous smile. However, after briefly sizing up Chunshi and Qin Shui, the woman quickly withdrew her gaze and then took out something similar to a magic weapon from her arms. That thing was spherical, about the size of a palm, and had a metallic texture. There were many strange symbols engraved on the spherical surface. After the woman took out the small ball, a faint fluorescent light emerged from her palm. Then the small ball floated up strangely. At this moment, the woman said to the two companions beside her, "There's a problem. The spiritual chi is much less than I thought. Based on the current situation, we only have the time for an incense stick to burn at most." Hearing this, the man in green immediately asked doubtfully, "An incense stick's worth of time? Didn't you say that we have at least 2 hours?" "I don't know what's going on." The woman frowned. The cannonball that had already flown in front of her suddenly stopped in the air, as if it had hit a wall of air. Then the two waterspouts seemed to have come alive. They fiercely poked their heads down from the sky and pointed at the destroyer in the shape of a bow. From afar, how were these waterspouts? They were simply two flood dragons that were ready to pounce. As the woman pointed from afar, two waterspouts immediately shot forth, spiraling toward the destroyer viciously. Flood dragons emerge from the sea, swallowing thousands of miles of mountains and rivers. In the face of this monstrous wave, what was the difference between the destroyer and a wooden boat? Boom! With the rumbling sound of the waves, the overwhelming wave instantly slammed the destroyer to the bottom of the sea. When everything returned to silence, there was nothing left on the vast ocean. Chapter 286. There was an old saying in Wuxia. The police of the Pacific Ocean were very strict. The people of the United States had always been arrogant and self-proclaimed to be the world's overlords. They would go to other people's territory in the name of maintaining world peace. Naturally, many countries were angry, but didn't dare to say anything. It just so happened that the heavenly vision appeared in the high seas not far from Okinawa. So the people of the United States naturally came to join in the fun. But what these people of the United States would never have thought was that they kicked a steel plate this time. The woman was called Shui Xiang by her companions, and with her skill just now, Qinshi also guessed that her cultivation method should be inclined to the water attribute. Therefore, the endless Pacific Ocean in front of him was obviously her home ground, provoking others in their home ground, and the other party was a celestial being. What was the difference between such behavior and the kamikaze squad of Japan? Qinshi silently played the role of a spectator. In fact, since these three people appeared, he had been seriously thinking about a problem. That was, should he make the first move to gain the upper hand? Perhaps because they were bold, the three of them didn't set up any soundproof restrictions when they were discussing things just now. Therefore, the conversation between the three of them was also passed to Qinshi's ears. Dayo? Changli? Although he didn't know what these two terms meant, it could be speculated that one of them should refer to the divine general, who had died under his sword. The three of them obviously didn't know that the divine general was dead, so they only mentioned looking for him, not revenge. In that case, then should he take advantage of the opportunity, when they were acting separately, and kill the three of them one by one? Or should he keep his composure and pretend that nothing had happened? Qinshi thought about this problem very seriously. Just when he was hesitating, the woman suddenly turned her head and looked at him and Qin Shui. At this moment, within a radius of 10 miles, except for Saito Ijiro on the boat, only Qin Shui and Qinshi were left. Qin Shui was just a warrior who had just stepped into the celestial realm, so the woman didn't take him seriously at all. As for Qinshi on the side, because she couldn't detect any fluctuation of spirit energy from Qinshi, she only thought of Qinshi as Qin Shui's follower. The woman's temper was not very good to begin with, and after being provoked by a group of ants, she was even more furious. Thus, when she saw the small boat below, she couldn't help but wave her sleeves again. Immediately after, a huge wave rose from the sea below and smashed directly in the direction of the small boat. Seeing this, Ijiro Saito didn't even care about the boat. He jumped into the sea, and then ran wildly on the water. The wind is tight, retreat. The woman had only casually raised a huge wave, and it was enough to frighten this Inyang Liao executive, who scrambled away like a dog. Fortunately, the woman didn't seem to want to argue with these ants in front of her, so when she saw Ijiro running away, she turned her eyes back to Qinshi and Qin Shui. This was the third time she had set her eyes on the two of them. Therefore, the moment she looked at Qin Shui, he felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave, and all the hair on his body stood on end. Seeing this, Qin Shui could only tilt his head slightly and whisper to Qinshi, "Mr. Qin, how about, let's go?" Although Qin Shui didn't know what level of strength the woman in front of him had reached, he knew very well this woman was definitely not someone he could mess with, so he subconsciously wanted to leave here. Qin Shui proposed his idea, but Qinshi didn't seem to hear him. Instead, he turned his head and looked in the direction of the destroyer with interest. At the same time, the woman in the air seemed to have noticed something, so she quickly turned her head and saw 2 missiles suddenly shot out of the sea. The missiles broke through the surface of the sea, and after flying to a certain height, they suddenly turned the warhead and blasted directly in the direction of the woman. At the same time as the missiles were fired, several figures suddenly emerged from the bottom of the sea. It was the group of United States soldiers. But what was strange was that these soldiers were all wearing a set of metal armor-like equipment at the moment, so from a distance, they looked like a group of robot soldiers. This should be the exoskeleton armor secretly developed by the United States. I didn't expect this technology to be mature enough to be used in actual combat. Qin Shui's reaction was also extremely fast. After seeing the appearance of this group of robot soldiers, he quickly explained to Qinshi, "Mechanical exoskeleton armor." This was a project that the United States had been deeply researching and developing in recent years. The purpose was to allow ordinary soldiers to have extraordinary combat capabilities. Chen Qi's eyesight was much better than Qin Shuai's, so he saw it very clearly. The shape of these exoskeleton armors was somewhat similar to the mass-produced version of Iron Man 2. The United States had only been founded for more than 200 years, so naturally, they didn't have as deep a cultural heritage as Wuxia. Although they didn't have martial artists or necromancers, they could make ordinary soldiers have the strength to fight with martial artists through research and technology. And once the research and development was successful, it meant mass production. Because of the root aptitude and other reasons, ordinary people may not be able to reach transforming strength in their lifetime.